Hello there, everyone. So I have Zeal with me here today, and we're going to be discussing probably a twofold topic. We're going to begin with, um, well, the English Civil War, Manasseh ben Israel, Cromwell, who was an agent of the financiers of Amsterdam, and the readmittance of the Jews into England after the 1290 edict, which expelled them, and of course after that shortly after that, the formation of the central bank after the Glorious Revolution, and William of Orange, and throughout all of that time, it culminated in a great damage done to the Irish nation, and of course this was carried on as a policy by the British all the way through the 19th and, well, the 20th century as well, until, of course, the independence of the Irish people. And so you had the Irish famine as well. So we'll go into that too. And then we're going to tie that in with what's going on with the social changes, or what has gone on with the social changes in the US, and this phenomenon that we see of the neuroses and increased violence throughout the West, and of course the phenomenon of, for example, serial killers or increased violent tendencies amongst the population. So, with that, to introduce Zeal. Hello, Zeal. How are you doing, man?
Oh, how are you doing, Cyrus?
Yeah, I'm very well, man. I'm very well. So it's a new year, the
Yes,
2026. Quite
yes, Happy
crazy
New
to
Year.
believe. Yeah, Happy New
Mm,
Year. Yeah, yeah. So to kick this off, I think we should probably begin with Cromwell,
mm,
his connections with Manasseh ben Israel, and
mm,
of course the onset of the Civil War and the fomentation of it by these shadowy powers from Amsterdam. Um, so we read. I'll just start off with this quote really. So we read Isaac Disraeli draws again and again startling parallels between this and the French Revolution, notably in his passage on the press no longer under restraint and the deluge of revolutionary pamphlets and leaflets from 1640 to 1660. He writes about 30,000 appear to have started up, and later the collection of French revolutionary pamphlets now stands by the side of the French tracts of the age of Charles I as abundant in number and as fierce in passion. Whose hand behind the curtain played the strings could post up a correct list of 59 commoners, branding them with the odious title of Stratfordians, or betrayers of their country, unquote. Whose hand indeed? But Disraeli knew so much, now discreetly draws a veil over that iron curtain, and it is left us for us to complete the revelation. To do so, we must turn to such other works as the Jewish Encyclopedia, Sombart's work, the Joie, and Modern Capitalism, and others. From these, we learn that Cromwell, the chief figure of the Revolution, the English Civil War of 1642, was in close contact with the powerful Jew or Joie financiers in Holland, and was in fact paid large sums of money by Manasseh ben Israel, whilst Ferdinandez Carvajal, the great Jew, or the great Wa, as he was called, was the chief contractor of the New Model Army. So that's one thing you see throughout, in fact, all of history, actually, where you see these conquerors or these revolutions kick off, and they have professional armies behind them. It's not just a peasant revolution. And you're thinking, where did they get the money? Where did they get the credit, the extension of credit to,
yeah,
finance? Well, for example, in the case of Cromwell, this new model army, this professional standing army to battle the royalists, Do you have any
yeah,
opinions on that?
yeah. Well, like you're straight away into the heart of a kind of an important and sensitive and kind of complex question, and we transversed it, you and I, kind of briefly recently, and it was around this concept of the state, and I know that yourself and Arman kind of have covered some ground recently with very good cause. that I think the essential point that you arrived at was that the nation state was sort of used as a stepping stone to globalism, and I agree. I agree with you on that point, because essentially what happened was the nations essentially were manipulated into a point in Europe where they were led into various different wars against each other, for example, by external agents, by the creation of economic competition, by sort of military campaigns along their borders, etc. And for example, you could say, with specific regard to Germany and England, for example, would be probably the case in point. And if you were to use that example, the eventual defeat of Germany and the Axis powers in 1945, the West, as it were, the singularity of the West sort of reigned supreme, the Allied forces, and you could argue that um, conglomeration of nation states was essentially globalism 1.0, and fed into what we now see around us. But why I say it's a sensitive argument, and I'll get back to the stuff about Cromwell and whatnot, but Cromwell is sort of central to why it's a sensitive argument, and you hit upon it yourself there in your intro, is that with the new model army, and perhaps we see a new version of it today with ICE, with Trump's ICE troops, or any of these, Zelensky, for example, where you have essentially mercantile troops, hired guns floating around in the Ukraine, or the creation of terrorist groups, Hamas, which are created by Mossad, Israel. So essentially, like, the point is, you have these military units throughout history that are not conjoined to any nation state. They're essentially military units that have been put together by capital, by floating, exchange of currency, gold, money, and who you know. And here's the sort of catch-22 hub of the problem, nub of the problem, as it were. If the nation states were powerful enough, they should be able to usurp the powers of capital, and keep the tenant and power of capital at bay, to the point where things like the new model army should never or could never have existed, because the state would have been able to maintain its territoriality and enforce its own laws and stop these things from happening. And this is a very kind of resonant point. It comes through into the modern era. For example, in Silicon Valley, we have a lot of these software companies that are now conjoined into machine learning / AI / biodigital technologies, which are very much at the forefront of this stampede forward into Homo Deus, etc., and this new age that we find ourselves in. But all of these powers that are manipulating this technology and are kind of building this, these military machines, are sort of from within the military industrial complex, and essentially the corporation. And the corporation has taken power and jurisdiction over national sovereignty, and has taken jurisdiction and power over constitutional law, and they are running amok. And like the figurehead, for example, for this is someone like your president number 47 himself, who is a manifestation of this. He's a corporate figure. He comes from, he's one of Roy Cohn's, the late Roy Cohn's, was his handler. He comes directly from the people that we're talking about. And that's not just pointing the finger at who, it's pointing the finger at the wider sort of committee that manifested back in as you say, in that part of in the 1600s, between Oliver Cromwell and Manasseh ben Israel. Because both of these, the more corrupt elements within the state, who were not constitutional, started making alliances and sort of footholds in with international capital. The latter being having some of its manifestation in people like Manasseh ben Israel and that group of people around him who found themselves in Holland back in the day. So this is a kind of catch-22 complexity of this situation. And to put the point in a completely other light, if, which we do not have, I argue we absolutely do not have any nation state since 1945. We don't have independent entities that are making their own minds up about things. So, for example, in Europe, we're very much within the European Union. We're very much monopolized singularity, and there's very starting to become very, very little boundary between us and America. We're sort of all in the same boat, as it were. But the point I want to make is, if we had strong nations, each of us would be able to make our own decisions, have our own culture, enforce things like our own immigration laws, or we could make decisions around these narratives such as this rainbow flag situation, this climate change situation, various different as Alan Partridge would say, political hot potatoes, like around the vaccine and stuff like that. So, like, if we had strong nations, we would, in theory, be able to offer much more resistance to this tidal wave that we find ourselves surrounded with. But we don't. And while we don't have that power, we surrender much more to globalism, and we surrender to what they want. So it's kind of like, one criticism I had, and okay, I'm giving a very reductionist
Mhm.
summary view of the points you might have made, and I apologize if I'm not delineating your point, or maybe I'm interpreting it in a more simplified way. But you see, there's a bit of a catch-22 in it. I see that if we had strong nations in the first place, we wouldn't be where we are. So it was the usurping of these national vehicles, in Europe, and their eventual compromise that has led us to the situation, but not nationhood itself as a concept itself is not what led us here. It's the weakened, corrupt versions of those. It's this corruption actually that was inherent, in this process that is the problem, or has been the problem. So then, you may argue, well, how do you arrive at an uncorrupt state? Is that possible? Is that, and you yourself asked me this question, I think, in recent communication, and I think you're right. We cannot eventually, there is no perfect state, as it were. The state is, it's something it's our best guess. Like, if we need a strong military, where we can defend ourselves, if we need, a strong political and jurisdiction, um, legislative capacity, for example, the eventual manifestation of that will of the people is the state. It's sort of unavoidable. But I concede to you that it remains corrupt, and it remains, it can collapse and kind of fall into a lesser condition, and again must be revived. And I feel this cycle is inevitable with this, with the life force of the state, as it were, that it rises and falls and has. But what I do not agree with is this concept that we completely abandon the vehicle, because I think it leads us into much more dangerous territory. But anyway, that's to digress slightly.
Yeah,
So
the way I see it as well is, I don't think you can fix the system from the top down. Um, but the thing is as well, it's like what you're saying. Yes, you do need something that allows the people to join ranks against, an external foe, or
yeah,
even, of course, an external foe that is of a more clandestine nature, should we say? But it must that must come from the bottom up. So it must be something that is
yeah,
as organic as can be, and you have
yeah,
to have strong families as well. I mean, of course, ultimately, what we're seeing here with the corrupted nation state, um, it was created by a cabal of our enemies. It was
yeah,
corrupted rather by a cabal of our enemies, I mean,
Absolutely.
we could certainly make the case for Ireland. Ireland was
Yeah.
that was corrupt. It was corrupted, and then you
Yeah.
had, of course, Poblack Naran, the Irish Republic. That was the final sort of crucifixion of the Irish
Yeah.
people, from my opinion. And that was the hijacking of what was organically there
Mm.
into, of course, I mean, Ireland is geographically isolated, right? It's an island, so it's always it's going to form some sort of common cultural milieu anyway.
Mm.
It's just a fact of the geography of the place. But there are regional differences. But as you could see, people did come together, um, and they formed something that could oppose. At least for some time, could oppose an external foe and external clandestine foes as well. But there's really no defeating a relentless cabal of your enemies, ultimately, especially if the nation state. But yeah, you need something, and this idea of nationhood, that itself can actually be formed amongst the tribe as well, because that feeling of nationhood is what ultimately the nation state captures. So the nationhood itself within the tribe can just be as powerful as one on a larger scale. That was also my point. That's a reason they got rid of the clan systems both in Scotland and eventually in Ireland as well. And of course, even worldwide, they're getting rid of the family units,
Mm.
which are effectively clan systems, just
Mm.
on a sort of different configuration. But yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I think we just have a slight distinction in the way that
Well,
we view it.
the other point, like, is even speaking these words, I feel horribly anachronistic. Like I'm talking about something from a bygone age that absolutely has no relevance at this time. Like, but that, I mean, the only way I can kind of put it into perspective, like the, we talked about this Jewish concept of renewal, and to borrow that term, the only way really to undo or to attack um, what we see developing around us at a kind of rapidly accelerating rate would be to topple the system in our own countries. And what I mean by that is a very real and visceral civil war. Like, I mean to actually conflagrate and just go into a full scale conflict within, and you know to enter a very dark and violent period of unrest and of upheaval. And this is, I'm not advocating it as such, and I wouldn't condone it as such. Let me make that clear. However, the only way to topple it would be by such means, from what I can see. And you have sort of two options. And like, as yourself and Flight of Eros sort of intimated in the, I think it was the last discussion that I heard you guys talking about, both of you sort of seem to come to the conclusion that the system as is trying to manifest a system without loss, without entropy. So because of the innate unnatural kind of uh, type of a system that they eventually hope to manifest, it will be inherently imbalanced. And by virtue of that imbalance, eventually that system is doomed to collapse in on top of the power structure. So, one method to wait for is to literally wait for the system to arrive at its own undoing. So that's one method. The other method is to actually attack it. And as I understand it, the only way for this to happen is would be literally for the nation states to um, actively pursue a sort of civil war scenario. But having said that, we've already been there. Ireland itself has already been there, only, in recent memory, and sometimes in recent living memory, depending on who you're talking to, as the 1920s. In Ireland, for example, we were in a civil war. And as you rightly point out, the Irish Republic that manifested out of that civil war was a fake, phony, sham republic. And you are right in stating that the Irish nation that is a sort of a hollowed out, fake, manufactured, kind of a it's a nation of betrayal. That's exactly what it is. It's a nation of betrayal. Everything about it is betrayal. And but even me saying that, I'm echoing back the ghosts of the Irish Civil War, and I'm kind of summoning, as O'Casey would have said, the Irish playwright, the shadow of the gunman. I invoke the shadow of the gunman, like that's inherent in Irish politics and Irish history. That gunman, the balaclava, as it were, that ghost kind of lurks in around us here in Ireland all the time. And we've learned that he must be kept at bay. And this betrayal, or this sort of treaty that we signed with our own enemy, literally became it became the best solution that we had, and it was the worst outcome and the best solution, if you will. So that was where Ireland kind of found itself in this kind of catch-22 kind of situation, like where we signed this piece of paper, that. But like I said, it was signed with our own enemy. So then you arrive at a state where the nation and the manifestation of the people is very, it's sort of psychologically cracked and psychologically kind of broken. Yet it's able to go about its day-to-day business, if you will. But you have this weird schism within its own mindset, where it's never, like, it has never manifested or realized itself, its inner will, inner ambition. It's never actually found that, but it came to a kind of a compromise. And I suspect maybe some of that might be true with Scotland,
Yeah, well,
perhaps.
absolutely, yeah. Well, we had the same sort of thing. You had the proto nation state and declaration of Arbroath, the idea that if even if but 100 of us still draw breath, us Scots still draw breath, we will never succumb to English dominion. And we don't fight for riches or glory. We fight for freedom, that which no honest man alone would give up on um, give up before death. So absolutely. Again, we could argue that that was sort of proto-nationalism because it was the Barrett. It was really not to do with Scotland per se. It was to do with their power, their the barons, and maintaining their baronies and things like that. But yeah, that is there. They were playing upon something that was already there within the popular imagination. But the idea that I think as well, and this is why I bring up the nation state, is because the way I see, the cabal of our enemies and their organizational structure is far more efficient than what we have.
Mm,
And where for example, our nation states um, heavily diffuse uh, power or personal responsibility, I think would be a better term. The personal responsibility is diffused amongst millions of people, right? When you have these smaller scale outfits, ones that are Dunbar compliant, the personal responsibility is very much on the individual. So the onus is on the individual to act in the best interests of the group. So this is where you get better cooperation and more organizational efficiency, where instead of having decision making on a 4-year time scale in terms of nation states, you can have it on a 4-week time scale or what have you. And it's what you see, for example, with the robustness of any revolution that is successful throughout history. I mean, For example, let's look at the Easter Rising, right? Those individuals, of whom were small in number, they, of course, they were fighting for the idea of Ireland, right? Especially there was about 485 people killed, I think, in that 1916 Easter Rising, and the 16 leaders were formally executed. But each of those, leaders, Patrick Pearse, Thomas MacDonagh, Thomas Clark, you name it, they all went willingly to the firing line. Now, that type of fanaticism can only be born in small scale cliques like that, because they have great organizational efficiency, and the personal responsibility, that onus, is on the individual. It's not diffused amongst, a million or so people. So they were fighting for the idea of Ireland, but ultimately they were fighting for their brothers. Their I think it was the Fenian Brotherhood or whatever it was called. So they were fighting for this fraternity. It's the same with any of the secret societies. That's why these people are willing to destroy their own nations, right? Of course, they don't even see it as their own nations, the leaders and such, right? Of course, a lot of them are doing it for personal gain. Let's not kid ourselves here. But there are a subsection of people. If all of this fell apart, people would go to their grave, and they would try and take as many people with them as they could for the cause. And it's that type of fanaticism that will conquer the world. And for me, I don't think that organizational efficiency can be properly expressed through the nation state as we know it, with after the 1789 revolution properly in France. I mean, we could argue they tried it with the English Civil War when they tried to introduce a republic and all of this. They tried it, of course, in the Confederalist Republic of the Netherlands, but it really only became sort of a solidified concept with the 1789 French Revolution. So the idea I'm stating with critiquing the nation state is that I think our enemies actually have it. They have developed a system that actually will allow them eventually to conquer the world, and to actually have a nation state that will control the world imperially. And so I'm not saying we should mimic their amoral behavior, but we really should take a look at their organizational efficiency, because I think it beats us. And yeah, so and the thing is, it fosters love. It fosters actually true love amongst all the compatriots within that clique or that group or that Dunbar compliant nation. And yeah, you can't beat distributed networks. A hierarchy will always lose to a distributed network. So the way I'm viewing it is more organizational efficiency. Don't get me wrong, I'm not denying that we don't need a nation, but ultimately, it's do we want to have the nation that is susceptible to these distributed networks that are Dunbar compliant, and act on these sorts of more organizationally efficient scales and scopes, or do we want to sort of mimic what they have and defeat them that way? Because think about it as well. Absolutely, yeah. The end of history will end in a bloody return of history. It always happens. It's just the way the cookie crumbles, so to say. And we're at the end of history, as declared by Francis Fukuyama in that famous neoliberal book, right? And we're awaiting the bloody return of history. Everyone can feel it. It's sort of that tension, that electricity in the air. We're just awaiting the spark to ignite the powder keg, so to say. But the only way, and of course that will end in the deposing of the vast majority of at least the Western governments as we know them in Europe. But the only way to be able to steer that chaos efficiently is if we have far more mobile sort of cohorts of of nations, so to say. I mean, for example, look at the Roman legions. The way, and even the uh, the imposed reforms of What was his name? Gaius Marius, I think his name was. Um, Essentially, what he did is he took the Roman phalanx system, which was being used by Rome prior to the Marian reforms, and he essentially created small cohorts, contingents of men that could be subdivided down, and from their legions. And essentially, each of those subdivisions themselves were their own nation. And this is exactly what what brought them strength. It allowed them total flexibility at the same time as being totally impervious, and because they could all reform very quickly and have a united front against the enemy. But they could also maneuver if they met rough terrain or what have you, right? Because they could reform into these smaller contingent groups, these cohorts. This is exactly what our enemy is doing, and that was ultimately what I was trying to. Well, that's what I was trying to convey. I don't know what Armin was, his point. He can maybe talk to that, but that was my point regarding that talk and on the nation state.
Uh, well, I think some of the emotion really in this thing is kind of frustration, because in the good old days you had a good old war and you could have a good old rebellion, and you know things were, that instinct to retaliate where you sensed oppression. At least there was avenues in front of you where you could react and push that energy towards, and sort of try to move against those who were moving against you. But in this scenario, it the frustration is inherent, because it's very difficult to know what to push against. I mean, it's as if any type of use of force basically is out the window, because I mean, what do you fight against? And not to harp on about Irish history too much, but it's not in it's in within living memory here, where we had soldiers from another country were here, and were literally shooting the chickens in the farmyard, or were you know they were basically up to all sorts of no good around here, like around where I live. So you grow up with that sort of vigor to react against that kind of occupation, as it were, by an enemy force. And fast forward to the modern era, where we have similar sort of a scenario, where with this kind of occupation of this global culture, as it were, and cultural modification and propaganda, and all that's coming with it, this new tech and etc., and centralization. And it's very difficult to know how to react against it. So I mean, deep down, it's how does one react? I mean, there was a critical comment on some video going back some while ago, and some person said, all you guys are doing is talking. And it hit, like, the comment hit. And lately, perhaps I've thought a little bit, is the person right in saying that? And even if they are right, then what's the answer to that? Like, at what point, what can we do, as it were? And I ask you that as an open question.
For me, there still isn't enough. There isn't enough people within the population that truly understand. Even on the, like what you're saying, of course, there's a great deal of this that's amorphous. It's amorphous because it's designed to be such. So you enter this state of confusion. There's a lot of people within the population that still don't really know who, uh, let's say, who really what's going on, right? What the primary the primary enemy from which all of this is stemming from, and also as well, people are saying, what do we do? What do we do? You guys are just talking. But really, that's what they do. They talk as well. They have tractates, literally, thousands of pages long, where they're literally just debating each other. Why? Because fundamentally, what we're creating in these circles is it's a tribe. That's what we're creating. It is the nucleus of a thought form of like-minded individuals who have a singular or at least shared spirit, um, and who understand each other, who understand what is going on, and who will have each other's back when the time comes. Now, of course, we are international, but there's a lot of us within, for example, the hub. There's a lot of people that are close by, that are close together. And of course, some of us have even met up, right? We've travelled, met up. Um, Fundamentally, I don't know, of course, like what you're saying, the Irish mentality of this is, and it's similar to the Scottish mentality, and even arguably the English and the Welsh. There's a problem. We direct our aggression at the problem to make the problem go away. However, the problem that we're dealing with is not quite that problem. We're all hammers and we think the problem is a nail, right? Because fundamentally, within our current state, that's the only function that we have. But the problem with this is that it's not a nail. So we have to, as the hammer, um, reforge ourselves within the crucible of thought, within the crucible of this intentional covenantal tribe, to thus birth something that's new, that perhaps mimetically takes off. And eventually that will infect other people. So they do something similar. They form their own tribes, their own cliques, their own collectives. Again, it's like the Legion, right? We will have cohorts of individuals all about that will have, in time, hopefully, may come together to oppose our enemies with a united front. So the problem is, if it was as easy as just simply overthrowing them with violence, this would have sorted itself out thousands of years ago. When, of course, they were less powerful. But the problem that they pose is one that is it's unconventional, it's extremely intricate, and it's one that actually demands of us a new tactic, the
Yeah.
formulation of a new societal and identitarian organizational structure. And it's one I don't think we've sort of grasped yet. And in
Yeah.
fact, it's one that all of the other victims throughout history did not grasp either, until, of course,
Mm,
the final. Think about it. Rome was taken down by this group, right?
mm,
Rome was the greatest power that the world really, arguably had ever known. I mean, its imperial domain stretched for millions of miles. Pardon me, millions of square kilometers. Um, and it was one that maintained itself for a thousand years or more, even with all of the Trojan horses that tried to erode it and chip away at it. It maintained itself because it was, of course, such a versatile social idea, right? The Roman Empire, or just merely Rome itself. Um, but eventually they succumbed, because the problem is, the way they viewed this problem is they viewed it as a problem of that could be solved vis-a-vis military means. But the issue is, with our enemies, they want to be attacked. They're actually they goad people to attack them.
yeah.
And let's be honest, it's like any sort of pest, right? Um, if you try to take out I don't know, a nest of rats or what have you, or whatever it may be, sure, you can wipe out the nest there, but the problem is the thing is so infectious, it's so versatile and maneuverable that it can simply just survive the culling, the extermination, and eventually, of course, the exterminators, the fumigators, they lose energy. They believe, they have a few victories here and there, and then they believe they've won the war, which is, of course, what happened with Rome. It's what happened with the Seleucid Empire with Antiochus IV Epiphanes. They had a few little triumphal victories, and they believed, this group had been conquered. That's no. In fact, it only exacerbated them. It's like the Hydra. The more you cut at its head, the more heads will grow from that wound and multiply, so on and so forth. You must strike it at its heart. And the only way to do that, of course, is you have to actually compete with them. You have to compete with them commercially. You have to hit them where it hurts, and you have to um, d- effectively devise and implement an organizational structure that is resilient enough to go up against their organizational structure. The only way to do that is to literally create parallel nations. That's what I was sort of getting at within the videos, and I was going to get onto it later on, but um, that's pretty much what you need to do. So, for example, in Ireland, forget the Irish Republic, or even in Scotland, forget the devolved Parliament of Scotland. We have to start creating tribes within our own nations, ones that are devised by our own ingenuity, and ones that are devised along the lines and within mind of organizational efficiency at the highest rungs. And yeah, of course, we have to develop and control our own national monomyth. I mean, it's a given. We can't leave that up to these larger scale governments, because that's what empowers the governments. Is this, this idea of, for example, Scottishness as it exists right now, or Irishness as it exists right now, or Britishness as it exists right now. The reason these are fictions is because they're fundamentally a hijacking and an imposition of a false identity for the
Yeah.
the prime reason of propping up what is a treasonous government, a government that actually claims one thing, to be representing the Irish people, the Scottish people, the British or English people, whatever, but does the exact opposite. But the problem is people are so confused, right?
Yeah.
They think, well, they're telling me they're the British government, yeah, but they always say our government isn't, it's they're not following our interests. Yes, because they still haven't crossed that bridge. It's not your government. It's not your nation. This was a theme
Mm.
park that was established by someone else. So we have to take that power back and establish a new identity ourselves, right? A new Irishness, a new Scottishness, a new Englishness. Um, and we have to establish it on our own terms. I would even go as far to say get rid of the anthems, get rid of the flags, reimpose new flags, new anthems, a new motto, a new constitution, a new identity. Because once you have that in place, you don't even need a revolution, because the government would lose its mandate. It only maintains its legitimacy, or its sort of a legitimation rather, because it's not legitimate at all, through the legitimizing effect of these false identities which they've established and they have ownership of. We need to take that ownership back. And yeah, that's what I think. But it's the
Yeah.
same with the Free State of Ireland when that was created too. Um, they redefined what it was to be Irish. Ultimately, that was something that was um, that sort of revolutionary spirit. And of course, it was born in blood, absolutely. But um, it's that sort of idea. What do you think about? Sorry, I went on a bit of a rant there, but what are your opinions on that?
Yeah, it's well, you know, essentially we're sort of slowly trying to develop a resistance, as it were, or at least a consciousness and awakening, some sort of a sensibility of who we are versus what we see around us, and including the culture that we see around us, the nation state that we currently see around us, the governments, etc., that we see around us, all of it. But like, I suppose it's where can we go with it? I mean, where do we go with it? And as you kind of saying there, we're not sure yet, like, and but there's not necessarily wrong with that right now, because I think that maybe a lot of people are trying to figure stuff out, and they're trying to figure, well, hang on, what is this stuff, and maybe they hear a conversation like this and they kind of go, oh, those guys are kind of thinking along the same lines I'm thinking, and there's a resonance there, and it's the start of something. So maybe maybe we're playing our part now, as it were, to slowly kind of assimilate component parts to some sort of another way of thinking. And one thing I think you kind of hinted at it there, I kind of agree with, is like the use of force over time. It seems that it didn't get us anywhere. It didn't get anyone anywhere, actually. And the use of military force, or any kind of weaponized insurrection or rebellion, seems to almost nearly always have been thwarted or usurped, or sort of been filled with a fifth columnists or whatever, and kind of been turned upside down. And I include some of the Irish thing in that, because even some of the people I've met over the time in construction, I've met some fellas, for example, who were from the north of Ireland, and they told me firsthand that the senior management in the paramilitary and kind of Irish nationalist, as it were, and in this case, political organisations, ended up with holiday homes in Donegal, whereas the fellas who actually did the dirty work ended up with PTSD in a council flat in Belfast and drank themselves to death. So, like, there you have your kind of glorious, romantic Irish revolutionary. That's the reality of what happened. What happened? It was a dirty war. And which brings me to a wider point about this gun control thing. Like, I don't think we seem to have this narrative once in a while, like they want to get rid of guns. They want to get rid of guns. The power structure wants to take guns off the American people, for example. And I wonder about that sometimes. Is that what they actually want? Because sometimes it seems to me that they're quite happy that that people are shooting at each other or whatever, and at times it suits them. And what another kind of a wider point is that anytime civilian populations have had weapons, it hasn't necessarily proved a huge problem for a mobilized military force. So, for example, an example of that would have been the Wehrmacht in World War II, who would have encountered a lot of guerrilla kind of warfare in Europe, and they dealt with it. They dealt with it by use of force. So the point being that even though you may have a gun, and this goes to, like, in these communities in America that are living sort of off the grid, and they have their own they're quasi kind of almost paramilitary. They've got compounds, they're armed, they try and stay away from state authorities, as it were. They might be sort of right wing, or perhaps they're sort of anti-government or whatever. But, like, the point being that any of these entities have, despite the fact that their arms seem to have very limited capacity to put up any sort of a fight long term. Case in point, probably not a great example, but an example nonetheless would have been David Koresh in Waco, in Texas. There you had a compound and there was armed individuals who defended that compound, and they were dispatched in a very unsympathetic manner by federal agents, essentially burned them out and shot them out of it and killed them, and neutralized their whole effort to kind of maintain their compound overnight, as it were. So, like, can one infer from that, like that the use of force is in itself very limited? Then maybe you could go back to the Irish example and say, well, if you've got a confederated sort of um, paramilitary force, which, as you were kind of intimating there, it's cellular, or as you use your word, tribal in nature, where you've got a confederated amount, not necessarily a nation, but a confederated grouping that can kind of maintain some sort of paramilitary force, can kind of hold ground. But anyway, that's, I suppose, it's maybe getting a little bit away from your point, because I think your point is, generally speaking, that we're going to be fighting a new kind of war here altogether, where the use of force may not be a tenant at all, But
Well, the use of force eventually will. Well, if you were to reach that threshold where we were to reclaim the identity back from them, then there would be no need for the use of force against any of these states, because they would simply just peter out. They would have no mandate. Ultimately, the mandate still is uh, issued by the governed. The governed have to tacitly agree to it in some sense, even by their compliance, right? Their timid compliance. But for example, the idea of guns, yeah, absolutely, they love people killing each other. They couldn't care. Um, I think they were attempting to get the guns off people in the US, at least. During the 2010s, 2000s to 2010s, beginning with the Columbine thing, and onward. I think the last one was
yeah,
probably the last major one was like 2018, 2019. I think it was like Virginia Tech or something. But I think they realized we're not going to be able to do this, to take the guns off people. So what we'll do is we'll bring in Trump, and Trump will be able to utilize or to even embody the idea of Americana to such a degree that, if we anything that we want to do over these ensuing, 8 years or what have you of his presidency. In fact, it's been longer than that, because they brought Biden in, and with Biden, people knew, right, we won't overthrow him, or we won't try and do anything that will hamper the re-election bid of Trump. So that gave them even greater runtime with that whole ruse. But so Trump essentially is the anchor point, the leverage point, um, to control the American populace, the patriot populace, should we say? So effectively, it keeps them all disarmed, because they're never going to use their guns against the federal government, because of course they're in control, right? And there's enough division and fracturing within the patriot population, the ones that are pro-Trump, the ones that are, of course, seen through the entire ruse, albeit quite late in the game. But so they will never unite against the federal government. So it's a way for population control through the establishment, again, as we've mentioned, of fault lines within these various political camps. So effectively, it keeps them all disarmed. It keeps them in a socio-political stasis. And so, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, we could get into it. What observations have you made regarding, and we'll go back to Cromwell and things such as that, because in fact this ties in with this, but what observations have you made regarding the sort of symptomatic decline of civilizations and its connection with the, endemic, the eventual creation of endemic violence? Do you think it's all natural, or do you think it's socially engineered?
well, I know we were chatting briefly before we got on the call here. We're here on the Christmas holidays here in Ireland, and as you do, you start binge watching stuff. And some of the stuff I've been watching is a series called 48 Hours, which basically goes through sort of murder cases, and goes through the investigation, goes through the the MO, the killer, and what the what the motive was, and all the rest of it, the investigation, and like a lot of the ones, if not all of them, were based in America, and some of the cases that I like, it's not to say this stuff doesn't happen everywhere, which it does. It happens in Ireland just as much, Scotland, everywhere. I assume it's essentially the same kind of scenario, but like, if it gives you any sort of an indication into how people think and into what people are prepared to do and into how people react, if you quickly get a kind of a stark picture. And I concede that obviously when you're kind of watching this kind of content, it sort of skews your sort of thinking a little bit because you're focusing on one area. But like, I know this is off the back of an earlier discussion you had around this concept of some of the serial killer phenomenon, which was, yeah, some of which was, might have been confined to the American landmass. Obviously, it happened in other countries as well, but some of the more notorious cases in the West, at least, that we're familiar with in the 20th century are American. And I believe, if I'm right in saying that, the highest percentage of these cases happened somewhere between like the early 60s up to 1979. It's like, up on 85-90% of the recorded cases happened in that particular time period. So to answer your question, or to try and delineate it a bit, like, you're looking at nations in the West that have come through the First and Second World War, and in America in particular, you're coming through after those wars into, a Cold War era, into Vietnam and into Korea, the Korean War. And particularly if you take the example of Vietnam, Operation Phoenix as a particularly notorious sort of a military, how do you say it?
Black Op.
Yeah, essentially, the operation itself was particularly notorious, and the use of violence with regard to the interrogation of enemies, Viet Cong, as it were, and throwing people out of helicopters, torture, rape, mutilation, anything they could think of to shock and terrorize the native population. And essentially, the enemy seemed to have been performed with great abound during Operation Phoenix. And obviously, some of these soldiers came home from war into America and back into the civilian population. It's fairly well documented. The hippie movement, as it were, another sort of CIA covert operation that was fueled from within the military intelligence sort of agencies, as again, managing this whole dialectical narrative. But all of this sort of compounds an instinct within the nation, and this nation, as it were, America, it's an imperial nation. It's a nation of European settlers that are sitting on Sioux, Apache, Navajo hunting grounds and tribal grounds. So the white man came in there essentially and basically laid bare, slayed and enslaved aspects of the native population. So right from day one, you have murder one on American soil, and not only that, then we have 100 million African slaves forcibly taken from their homelands and forced to work as slaves, literally in this country. And like, that's so vast a kind of a thing to say that it's actually sort of impossible to psychologically digest that. Like this is the birth of the land of the free, as it were. And once that's taken place, you're into an American Civil War. You're into yet another conflagration between the European nations for control of that land, as it were, between France, Britain, England, etc. And you fast forward into the modern era. As I said, you're into basically two world wars, and so on and so forward. So I suppose to try and answer your question, and from having traveled in America myself, I spent some time there actually. I went to visit a friend in Boston a couple of years ago, a good few years ago now. And it was the Irish community there. They were going to the pub. They were listening to the diddly idle, diddly dee, diddly diddle, the Irish traditional music down the pub, and all the rest of it. Basically, it was like I hadn't left Ireland at all. And I remember saying to a friend of mine, I goes to him, "Look, I'm getting out of here, man. I need to see something of America, you know." And he says, "Well, what are you talking about, man? You're in America." And I'm like, "No, no, this is like, I need to get out of here. Like, I need to get out of the Irish thing." And he goes, "Well, what are you going to do?" "Well, I'm going to get the Greyhound bus," I said. And I was in Boston at the time. And he looked at me and he goes, like, "Nobody gets the Greyhound bus. You're going to get shot. Like, it's, nobody goes on the Greyhound in America. If you want to go somewhere, you fly." And I said, "No, I'm getting the Greyhound." So to make a long story short, I ended up getting the Greyhound bus from Boston down to Clarksdale, Mississippi, which was a long, long trip. I don't know how long it took me, man, 48 hours, 72 hours or something on the bus. But during that time, I traveled through sort of the heart of America, as it were, the back corridors of America. And it just hit me just how militarized the country is. Because everywhere you looked, you see the vestiges and the kind of symbolism of the military. It's like, fellas are coming off duty or they're going on duty, or there's flags, or there's people in uniform, or there's, it seems to be absolutely everywhere there. Ubiquitous, as they say. And, it's coming from a European country where such, that's not as magnified here, or it's not at all here. And you went over to America and you're seeing this. So, like, blood is everywhere there, like, blood, as it were, and violence is sort of seems to be um and sort of woven into the fabric
Yeah.
of the place, like, and I don't know, there was a kind of a resonance there, and I hope I haven't offended anyone of our American friends as such, or maybe someone would agree with me. But it might be a simple thing, like, I remember working in Chicago back in the day, and there'd be a pickup truck in front of us, and there's a little sticker on it, and it says "Pow Mia," Powmia, and there's this silhouetted figure with his head tilted forward. And I kept seeing this sticker on these different trucks, "Pow Mia," and I was like, "What is that?" Then I realized Pete Pow is prisoner of war, and Mia, MIA, is missing in action. And these stickers I was seeing was for people who had been either through the Vietnam conflict or subsequent conflict. Like, there's been so many, I actually have now forgotten to mention Afghanistan and Iraq, which are the much more recent. But there's been so many, that you forget to nearly mention the newer ones, as it were, like, But, like, it seems to me that it's absolutely embedded in the culture there. So these things like school shootings, and they seem to be the natural, and I take the point that some of them may or may not have happened, depending on who you're talking to and what the rumors are. I'd be absolutely open to some of that being true. I'm sure the powers that be wouldn't be shy to fabricating or manufacturing a psyop in that regard. But anyway, the point being that from watching the murder cases I've been watching recently online, it just echoed back to all that, and I just thought that people are sort of resonating psychologically on a certain level in America. Not everyone, but a lot of the sort of mainstream conservative society are on a certain kind of psychological level. There's a mean, if you will, an average. And that average psychology, after a while, kind of becomes detectable to the discerning observer. And I suspect as well that the power structure have spent a lot of time studying this mean, this average, and how to manipulate it. But I don't know if any of that
Oh
answers
no,
some of your question.
absolute. Well, I see it in the YouTube comments and various comments all over social media from Americans. When people die, even not even criminals, but just people do stupid things, and then, as they say, they win the Darwin Award. But even these ideas, I don't know if they're born out of social media, but social media itself is to some degree a reflection of the culture at hand. And of course, social media and the internet really is an American phenomenon. And so even if people from overseas are on there, they're acting and discussing, and they're even becoming culturally acclimatized within an American environment. And of course, this is not to put down America in any way, but it's just it's the culture that's formed there. Of course, Britain as well had a similar culture because, well, Britain has effectively been at war with every single nation known to man. I actually can't really think of a nation we haven't been to war with, or engaged in some violence with, right? And so all the way up through, I would say, to the mid 20th century, we actually had that same culture. It was a very hardy, violent culture. It was similar, of course, in Ireland, and but it started to dissipate. But what I see in the US is this, it's like this romanticization, it's this flirtation with violence, absolutely. And I mean, a lot of it appears to me to be almost like, now it's been accelerated by social media, but it seems to me to be very similar to Calhoun's mouse experiment. And right at the end, where you had in Universe 25, this utopia, and this mouse utopia, you had this behavioral sink, and oh, what did he call it? Actually, I have it here. Um, yeah, you had this idea of the sort of targeted elimination, um, and the pruning of deviants, right, or just simply the pruning of the pack. So you would find a great deal of along with sexual deviance and the loss of the maternal instinct, you would find a breakdown of cooperative actions, right? And within this behavioral sink, there was like a sort of pathological need for violence. Um, Expectant mothers or newborns from the mice mothers, they would kill their children. It would either be they would try to abort it while it was still in their belly, or they would just simply abort it, well, murder it in a sort of post-birth abortion, right? And then you would have mobs that would go after um, other animals, other mice within, that were perhaps on the fringe, perhaps ostracized from the larger groups. And yeah, it ended up everyone died, right? There was mate suppression was another thing. There was a major concern there. So effectively, cutting a long story short, everything you're seeing in America, in the West, really, but yeah, absolutely, America has a sort of flirtation with that violence. It does. I mean, it's a fact of the matter. Um, it's very similar to what you're seeing with Calhoun's mouse experiment and this behavioral sink. And yes, that has been accelerated vis-a-vis social media. But yeah, absolutely, you see this sort of cheapening of life.
Well, there was one case in particular that you know, the format for this TV program, as I said, it's an investigate. They interviewed the people that were affected in and around the case. You know, survivors or the police themselves, sometimes jury members, family members of the deceased, family members of the killer, etc., etc. There was one particular case. It just stood out to me that the behavior of the persons who were interviewed in and around this particular case, all of their behavior seemed to be what I would call detached from concrete reality. They all seem to have an almost, I want to say, abstract relationship with what had happened, what had actually happened. And they had kind of seemed to have sort of distanced themselves from what had happened. And, it was almost like it became something that was sort of kind of conceptual, not a real thing. And for example, in this one case, uh, this guy basically had set up a murder to kill his parents, his own parents. And if that wasn't bad enough, he'd managed to talk to two of his school friends, two of people he knew, into carrying out the murder. And even that fact alone, for example, that he had managed to talk one guy to drive a getaway car and the other guy to pull a trigger. And this was his second or third attempt doing this, and on each attempt he had managed to convince someone he knew, an ordinary civilian, someone he worked with, for example, or someone he knew from school, to carry out the act. And it was the third time he'd managed that they'd managed to actually kill his own mother and his brother. And so that alone, that aspect alone, that you had someone, a murderer, someone who was conspiring to murder their family members, had managed to find someone in their immediate circle on three different occasions. And
Oh
and
yeah,
these are just regular middle class people. His parents were, his mother was a school teacher, his father was an accountant.
yeah.
And you're kind of going, that fact alone. And the second part of it, then, like after these people had been killed, his father, the killer's father, was a Christian. So for the rest of the narrative, like the father is gone, like the father has not really been hit with the totality of what has happened. He's gone off on one saying, "Well, look, Jesus forgives,
Yes.
and that's why I want to forgive my son." And you're like going, none of it is hitting home. The reality of what has happened isn't hitting home at all. It seems like the man is detached and he's caught up in some sort of a Christian framework
It's a
work of
coping mechanism.
understanding it. I beg your pardon?
It's a coping mechanism for a lot of them, you know? It's a coping
Yeah.
mechanism.
And it
Yeah,
was,
totally.
even the MO of the killer, like he felt he wasn't loved. And, the family had bought him a Rolex on his graduation, and they'd bought him, nice cars and stuff. But he felt deep down he was, the whole thing wasn't adding up, really.
Well,
And
that sorry, man, please finish your point.
no, just as a look, maybe it's not a fair litmus test to the whole population, but like it was their behavior and the reactions around it. The people just seemed totally sort of detached, or kind of not in
Yeah.
contact with reality. And that's something I've seen. Look at it, maybe where all of our nations are guilty of it in different manifestations, but particularly in America, there's a particular American manifestation of that detachment. That's, after you start to kind of, you've seen it a few times, you start to you begin to see it a lot more, as it were. And again, I'm not saying that we're perfect in Ireland, or anyone is perfect in any other country, but in America, I don't know whether it was the turbo boost of the new world that just fed
That's
this psyche
that's
of
what I think
sort
it
of
was,
the
yeah.
dream, or,
That's
or, or what it was.
I think it's because see, we're going the same way here as well, and really, we're going the same way, uh, all over the West. I mean, all over the world, actually.
Yeah,
Even
yeah,
China is actually having this same sort of, detached nature when it for example, when it comes to, violence, and this is not us just picking on America, but what we have it's like what you're saying, they had the turbo they were turbo boosted, so to say, with the internet. They had it first. So
yeah,
they basically, lost themselves, with, the likes of, you know, the digital screen, right? So with the digital windows, so to say, it created something you saw in Calhoun's mouse experiment, which was this hyper self-consciousness, which was, you're constantly comparing yourself to other individuals, which increase it. And of course, there's not enough. If you have, like in Calhoun's mouse experiment, all of the basic amenities covered, you have all of these infinite resources, infinite shelter, all of this space. The problem is it doesn't account for, in social creatures, or even partially gregarious creatures such as human beings, that system, that utopia on quote unquote, doesn't account for status. Status is something that is, not necessarily, it's something that's finite, right? And this is what you see with any really civilization, is eventually you get to the point of, as Peter Turchin mentioned, elite overproduction. Now, those middle class individuals, and absolutely, they're actually the most susceptible to this
Yeah.
because they themselves, plus their offspring, they're in a social ennui, which is this sort of uh, spiritual deadness. This, like what you're mentioning, they're detached from reality itself,
Mm.
and the reason that is fostered within that civilization is because of, again, digitalism and these digital windows accelerating social anxiety and emotional instability vis-a-vis their feeling of a lack of power or status within, their community, within their family, whatever it may
Yeah.
be.
Yeah.
So even the fake titles that they have at work, they eventually realize that they're phony deep down on a subconscious level. They realize their jobs are phony. They realize all of it's phony. It's just this economic system that is effectively trying to mask. It's a lie trying to mask the truth, which is that, in the case of the American society, there is no American dream, and fundamentally, there is really no. There's no salvation, economic salvation, so to say. But again, the lie keeps you running the hamster wheel until, of course, you don't. Um, so yeah, absolutely, it
Well,
establishes that type, like what you were seeing with the son, where he didn't feel like he was loved. So it
yeah.
actually created what you saw within Calhoun's mouse experiment. It was a hyper aggressive free for all. That's what eventually took place and took the form of the society. Yeah.
Well, the backdrop, as it's funny you should mention it, for a lot of the cases I was looking at was sort of upper middle class white America. And like these, there people are living in $1.5 million home. They're living in a kind of a kind of fairly exclusive neighborhood. They've got money. They're doing well in life. You're talking about people with real estate. You're talking about people who, one family, they ran their own aviation business. They had aircraft. You're talking about people who are, they're people who are doing well, like, on the face of it. And like, they're very much, they've got it all sort of thing. But then when you start to, when you start to peel back the layers and you look into the case, each case, you start to see familiarities or, like a lot of the families, it might have been the second marriage. There might have been two kids from a previous marriage, or maybe the wife grew up without her mom and dad. She grew up with her uncle, and nearly pretty quickly, or there's a daughter who from a previous marriage who speaks later on in the thing, and she had, so you're starting to see sort of, and there's nothing wrong with any of that, but it's shall we say non-linear. It will be, they're non-linear familial groupings, and it seems to be almost like, in a lot of the cases you have this kind of a fracturing before any of the heavy stuff starts to happen. And but this backdrop of this white picket fence, the white pickets of that fence start to look like bones after a while, like femurs or rib bones or something. Like it starts to get dark very quickly, like. And I think that's what gives it its unique characteristic of when you see these kinds of crimes happening against this backdrop. Um, it gives it a very dark resonance to the society around it, because everything that's presented as being, um, you know, desirable and something to achieve and a goal, it starts to be tainted with this, these bloody stains. And I don't know, I just had a kind of a dark feeling about it, really, to be honest, and it just made me think about a lot of other things in American society, not just American, but as I said, but Western. As you said, we're probably catching up to some of this stuff ourselves here, or slipping down the slope ourselves, because no, not at all. And but like, I suppose in our own example, we were very insular here, and we had these um, little boxes that our minds were kind of hammered into, and but like with the shattering of those compartments, like you're now not necessarily freed from them, but you're a boot comes to stamp you down into a more shadowy social world again, because you've got these, like in Ireland, for example, we've a cocaine epidemic, and we used to be alcoholics, right? Now we're cokeheads en masse. Overnight, like we've abandoned the drink and taken to cocaine en masse. And suddenly, like, almost overnight, every town and village in Ireland is awash with cocaine. And, you get the corresponding culture around that, this kind of accelerated American Psycho, um, this set of anti-values kind of sets in. And it's a race to the bottom as such, like, but it informs so much of the cultural resonance around us, that it's like, it's back to the earlier point of the question, about forming tribes. You won't actually have to form a tribe. You'll just have to stay standing and let everyone else die off. Maybe maybe it's anti-war.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. You have to stand as the strong column, while all of the other
Yeah,
ones crumble. Another thing that pushes all of this as well is remember, and it pushes the phenomenon of serial killers as well. Don't get me wrong, a lot of these
yeah,
serial killers are actually we can look into Dahmer and God, there's a few of them actually, but Dahmer's a primary one. He is almost the Unabomber is another one actually, but these individuals were the product of MK Ultra, undoubtedly.
yeah.
There's several of them actually. There's a few CIA hitmen which are effectively serial killers too. Um, in fact, Dahmer
Well,
actually,
can I just,
yeah.
I just want to say something there, like before we get
Mm.
in on, and this, I'm interested in this topic. That is not to say we do not have the natural, ordinary phenomena of serial killers as well, that are not necessarily military or not MK Ultra. That we do have people who are capable of doing this kind of stuff.
Oh,
Do you agree with
absolutely.
that? Like,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, the thing is as
yeah,
well. The serial killer phenomenon really, of course, it still goes on. You have the thing, the smiley face killer, I believe, which is a rumor going about. They've not. I don't believe police have actually tied them together, these killings, but the body of evidence is quite compelling to say the least. But most of them took place between the 40s and the 90s, and afterwards, really. I'm not saying it doesn't. Of course, it goes on. Actually don't need governmental involvement in this, because you live
mm,
within a social framework where um, the serial killer effectively isn't an anomaly. It's actually a sort of
yeah,
predictable element of it, because the system suppresses natural aggression and even the competitive drive. And of course, it's only a matter of time until, in some individuals who are less capable of controlling those impulses, until, of course, they explodes into high neuroticism and then, of course, predatory behavior. But and of course, you have the loss of not just status, but with status that is tied to the hunt. And humans,
yeah,
whether we want to believe it or not, are apex predators. We have the drive of the hunt in us. I mean, I've relayed the story previously where I was up in Brecon, and which is up north, and I was walking on Munro there, but there's a clearing up to the sort of base of the Munro. Well, not a clearing; it's a forest up to the base of the Munro, and you've got a glade in the middle and that, and there was deers migrating through it, and I caught the sight of the deer, and right away it was like a natural instinct, you sort of because I didn't want to spook it, but I wanted to get a good look at it, because you rarely see this, deers grazing, but I could feel myself. There was like a primal thing inside of me that was like, I was trying to move slowly. I was, pick which way is the wind blowing? Is it carrying my scent?
Mm.
So my brain itself was, tapping into something that was primal. But you have the loss of that, and of course they've tried to fill it with the artificial sense of work and career and promotion. It doesn't work. It's not. It's basically a poor simulacra, and so
Mm.
you know when the struggle for survival is basically replaced by um, a sterile hall of bureaucratic departments and a bureaucratic existence, like what we saw in Universe 25. The human drive for the hunt, for even conquest itself, whatever you want to call it, status, that doesn't go. It just actually becomes a shadow. It becomes perverted. So it's
But
mhm.
notwithstanding that point, we do seem to have observable phenomenon when we look at things like serial killers with military backgrounds, and I think you spoke about in the past some unusual, that these people aren't necessarily working alone at certain times. Some of these more infamous cases, and I know you spoke about that in the past.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's you have Hodel. Hodel was, I mean, that
Yeah,
the Black Dahlia killer. He was most likely the Zodiac killer as well. So he appeared
yeah,
in a sort of 20, 30-year time frame. Probably the Jigsaw killer in Manila, the
mm,
Philippines. Yeah, and pardon me, sorry, Manila City, I think it's called in the Philippines. Now he well, actually, it's already well known because, funnily enough, we had a deathbed confession letter from an individual. I forget his name now. It's been some time since I looked into the case, but he said himself in this letter that they knew who was the lipstick murderer. That was murders in LA, in the same area in LA, around about the same time as the death of Elizabeth Short, the Black Dahlia. Um, those were those occurred in, of course, the same time period. The same sort of modus operandi was present as well, but of course they were never connected. They should have been, but they were never, because there was a cover up, and we saw it in this letter. And he mentioned the lipstick murderer, the Black Dahlia murderer. It was It was a man by the initials GH, George Hodel, and he was a doctor
mm,
on Franklin Avenue, which is, of course, he was a doctor on Franklin Avenue. He lived in this sort of it was called the Franklin House. It goes by another name now, but it was a
yeah,
Neo-Mayan temple.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And of course,
yeah.
this is, funnily enough, something that was carried on by Peter Nygaard. Now, he wasn't a serial killer. He was a serial, sex pest, should we say. Um,
Mm.
and he was completely besotted with the idea of using stem cells from primarily aborted fetuses, and paying women to abort their children so he could take their stem cells and use it to effectively vampirically extend his lifespan artificially, to reach immortality. This is something, by the way, all of these crackpots that rule over us in this cabal, they all are, infatuated with this idea. By the way, so was Hodel. Hodel was
Yeah.
infatuated with this in a sort of surrealist, artistic point of view, right? Um,
Mm.
for example, he was pictured several times with the Mahan, was it Mahantaka? I think it's called. Or is it, no, Yamantaka? Pardon. That the destroyer of Yama,
Yeah.
or the destroyer of death, and he was looking at it
Yeah.
like, the idea is he is the Yamantaka. In fact, I did a 50-page sort of breakdown of this. I didn't actually, it was going to be a book. I didn't finish it, but if you look into the way that he artistically, this was all, for him, murder was art. The way he artistically placed this all out, her body, Elizabeth Short and the Black Dahlia, it itself invoked this idea of the cycles, the bisected, because she was bisected at the waist, the bisected cycle of death and resurrection. And the bisection itself relates to this astrotheological idea. And he was into astrotheology too. If you read his son's book on George Hodel by Steve Hodel, Black Dahlia Avenger,
Yeah.
I think there's 4 parts. He mentions this. He bought, before he died. He bought a he bought, well, he named a star. You could buy, in those days, you could buy a star and basically attribute your name to that star
Yeah.
within the star catalog, and it was in the constellation Aquila. And anyway, he left instructions to Steve where you could find it. Now, why did he pick Aquila? Well, he picked Aquila because, like what we're mentioning with Flight of Eros, and thinking back on it now, is because the way Aquila, which is the eagle, is behind the serpent's cauda, the serpent's tail, which intersects the waist where Elizabeth Short was bisected along, the zodiacal belt, Orion's belt. Again, everything is around the waist. It's around the bowels, where, of course, the waste management of the body is. And then it comes out, of course, serpent's caput. So you have that process of death and resurrection, transcending or transmuting oneself into a higher form alchemically through chaos, through death. And we know he thought this because in his final, I think it was his suicide note, but he never actually managed to kill himself before he died naturally, or of complications from some sort of disease he was affected by in later life. And this was in the 90s. And in the final, I think it was the penultimate line of that suicide note was, "Life is excreto. Life is waste. Life is literally, life is the bowels of the sun." So you have all of
Mm.
these sort of ritualistic serial killings that goes all the way back, by the way, into the medieval era. So that does go on too. Absolutely.
Does this tie in, just to go sideways a little second,
Mm.
with our French philosopher and his what's the gentleman's name? Flight of Eros was mentioning him.
Descartes.
No, our man with the waist and the oh god,
Foucault? No.
no, the accursed chair.
Oh, George Bataille. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, yeah.
But can you, how does it tie in with Bataille? Because I fail to sort of grasp this. I kind of
Right.
get it, but I don't get it at the same time. How does it,
So the idea is
to
that,
break it down simply, kind of?
yeah, so the idea is that if you think of the cycle of life and death as um sort of from the, I think Bataille actually used this term, from the mouth to the anus. So it
Yeah,
goes through this process of chaos and waste. And then, of course,
yeah,
the excretion of that is death, and death is
yes,
subsumed back into the cosmic oneness, the cosmic canvas, should we say, and that
yeah,
reestablishes life itself. So,
mm,
um, effectively, what you're seeing is no, an athanor, a self-feeding furnace, which is life. And by the way, this
mm,
is where the Tower Tarot card also ties in. With the Athanor is
mm,
the Tower Furnace, but so it's a self-feeding mechanism. And this is what Bataille was mentioning. And he was mentioning that a civilization itself is, in fact, even an organism, which a civilization is a societal organism, a social organism. Any organism is defined by um, the way it deals with the accursed share, which is the excess of its growth, or the excess
mm,
of the solar energy, should we say. Because all his idea is
mm,
all life itself is established by the initial sacrifice of the sun, that we are all cosmic dust. We are all born of supernova. We're all born and
mm,
we're all perpetuated vis-a-vis, of course, the sun radiating out its finite energy onto us on Earth. So It's this idea, and then of course as well. I mean, this explains why they have, for example, the Irish famine. By the way, the Irish famine ties in with the 1618 Great Dying, which just so happened conveniently to kill off the vast majority, I think about 90% of the Native Americans, the Powhatans, the Pemquid, all of these various tribes that existed in and about the area that the English Puritans or Pilgrims would settle just conveniently. They died of, I think it was a
Mm.
type of yellow fever. So, very convenient. Were they using some sort of bio warfare agent? Of course, we do have the notion too that they were lacing lacing blankets with smallpox and things such as that. So you have those two tie in. That is
I,
the accursed share. They are
mm,
utilizing sacrifice. War is another one. Utilizing sacrifice to effectively um, perpetuate the civilization and, of course, their position of power.
mm. I remember as well when last time I was in Scotland reading about the blight in Scotland in around the same time as the 1840s as it was here in Ireland, and wiping out, I assume, the potato crop there at the same time, in around that time.
And that blight can be introduced artificially.
Yeah,
All of these things, even contagions. See if you poison the water supply of
yeah.
whatever it may be. If you poison several water supplies, you could create the effects of poison, and then if you control the media, all you have to do is to reframe those effects of the poisoning, the clandestine poisoning that you enacted vis-a-vis the poisoning of the water supply. You could just simply reframe it, as a contagion. Oh,
Yeah,
it's a contagion. You're all dying because God has looked upon you unfavorably, or oh well, these things just happen. It passed from a bat, or it passed from a rat, or a bird. You know, these things can't be
but
helped. Yeah.
just not to bore anyone else who's already grasped this point, but I need to labour it a little bit. What, like, was it Hodel who said that life is waste?
Yes.
Okay, and like, what again? Is
So,
that
so,
straight out
so
of
that's
Bataille?
straight out of Bataille. I was going to mention that's effectively what Bataille mentions. I don't know if
And
he I
can
don't know if he uses that exact quote, but that's effectively a summarization of his entire thesis.
so essentially what he's trying to say, he's basically inverted what we would normally consider creation, us being fractal sparks of divine energy, as it were, that we would perhaps conceive ourselves as being of divine creation. So I assume many of us would anyway. But Hodel's statement sort of inverts that, and it kind of surmises that we're somehow a kind of a bastard exhaust fume out of the entire process that should not have happened, kind of thing.
Yes, we're basically solar expenditure without utility, and so the idea is it's actually a Kabbalistic idea. In fact, you can as I put in, oh god, what was it? I think I put it in the Synthetic Nation um,
Mm,
video that I did recently. I call it the Ayin, or the
yeah.
Ayin economy, or the economy of
Mm,
nothingness. And so basically, for example, with the double bookkeeping of fiat currency, what you actually have is that the creditor, the plus one, the yesh in Kabbalah, which is the sort of impetus of initiation, and the opposite of the ayin, which is the nothingness, in this case, in double bookkeeping, the debtor. Those two things fundamentally are the same thing, which they cancel each other out, thus creating an economy built upon nothingness, where you take the nothingness and you apply value to it. So you create money, which is nothingness. It has no value. Um, you it's the ayin. You use that through basically mind trickery, through work and what have you, and you make it, the model of scarcity. You apply value to it through that mind trickery. And so so you represent wealth with that, real wealth. And effectively what it allows you to do is like a black hole, similar to, I guess a void. You're dragging through this pool of gravity, dragging all the everything, the wealth into you, right, through this vehicle of the nothingness. So it's pretty much it's a Kabbalistic concept. The idea is that they want to control life, um, because they control life rather, vis-a-vis the understanding that life is itself born. It's the same as death, and it's born of the void, and it's born of the chaos. And
Yeah.
it's a really messed up way of looking at the world, but
Mhm.
I don't know. Fundamentally, it appears to be the case because they their position subsists on this entire belief, you know. But absolutely is it's a totally toxic idea. In fact, it manifests itself only in perversion and extreme violence. It's
Well,
think of it this way: it's like the dark arts of philosophy, and that's what they're
yeah,
utilizing, you know.
but like as you said, the dark arts, like it's back to these concepts of of like things like serial killers and murderers and the darkness really that over the land, as it were, sable wings over the land, to use a book title like came across not so long ago. But anyway, no, the point being, and like these things of for example, we see it lately with this ongoing regurgitation of these Epstein files, that we have essentially child abuse, etc., happening. We have school shootings, we have murders in our neighborhoods, we have all sorts going on, and it's reinforcing this concept of trauma, is it not? All the time, it's trauma, 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 and that kind of ties in with this kind of MK Ultra, like trauma with a view to control, you know, trauma as a fundamental mechanic of psychological control, which I think was part of Operation Phoenix in Vietnam as well. Um, through breaking people down and controlling them through these traumatic experiences. But I think it ties in, does it not, with the side, what you mentioned, this dark psychology, dark philosophy of these forces being sort of on a whim, you know, no value being ascribed to either force as such, one over the other, the good or evil, both being sort of just agents of which and whether, which and whether at any given time. Um, so like that evil could be done because it has as much moral right to exist as good, for example. So you end up with this completely morally subjective sort of outlook where where these dark deeds can take place because they're legitimized with this, because they're in creation, they are in the creation, so therefore they just have as much right to exist as anything else. From what I could see, that seems to be part of like what Hodel was trying to express through his heinous acts, like which he are kind of sort of there's a veneer of a kind of an artistic thing going on with him, with this kind of stuff. And his Wikipedia photograph, that his black and white photo, he's got this sneer on his face, like a self-smug, self-satisfied, self-assured kind of grin, and it kind of hints at this kind of thinking, like that we're on the inside, we understand how the universe work, we understand how the creation came out of the nothingness. Is that what you call it? The Ein Sof? Is that right?
Yeah, the nothingness.
Ein Sof.
Yeah.
Yeah, and within the nothingness, all is equal. Like, and everything should go back to nothing, because life is waste, as he said. We're an aberration away from nothingness. I think
Yeah.
Flight of Eros said it in the last chat. He said the natural state of equilibrium is death. The
Yeah.
natural, all things should return to death, like, which is fucking fairly. But, like, the thing that seems to, for me anyway, like, if they were right, all things should have collapsed and went back to death a very long time ago. But it seems to me that we still exist, and human consciousness exists. So over time, one can infer that over the course of billions of years, is that the destructive forces did not overcome the creative forces, as it were. The creative forces uh, rose to the top, and essentially good, if you want to use that term, came to the top and won, and is winning, and has won, and has always won. Because if it had not, like, we would have ceased to exist a long time ago. So we can infer, by virtue of our own existence, that that we are in our state of being, but also that we are in a good state of being, or we are in some good state, that these positive or constructive forces have triumphed, as it were.
Yeah. Well, the thing is as well, they are nihilists, and the reason they're nihilists is because they're actually just absolutely in fear of what they see as the aberration of life, right? And they're in fear of it because they don't want it to end. I mean, with Kabbalah, Judaism proper, it doesn't actually have an idea of the afterlife. It has no firm idea of the afterlife. In fact, in the Torah, and just the Tanakh in general, the Old Testament, it gives a. It, it, it's very it's a contradictory message, and in some sense, it says that resurrection will occur, and in another sense, in Kabbalah, in some Kabbalistic commentaries, it actually states reincarnation is such a thing. That's something I believe is held by the Chabad Lubavitcher cult, which is a sect in Judaism too, far more Kabbalistic, arguably. But they have no idea really of the afterlife. So if you don't believe that the afterlife exists, and you on some small level believe that all life is created ex nihilo, which is from the nothing, the nihil, hence why they're nihilists, then you're fundamentally going to see, as of course what we saw with Hodel. And by the way, Hodel, funnily enough, was from Russian Jewish descent. There was
Yeah.
an individual who was, the body of evidence that we have against him really puts him at the fore of the suspects of the Jack the Ripper case. And some have even claimed that he was the killer. I mean, it's without a doubt. He was also of the same Russian Jewish, I think it was either Russian Jewish or Polish Jewish, um, you know, um, extraction. So that puts them firmly in the sort of Chabad Lubavitcher area or catchment area. Thus, they would have been exposed to these Kabbalistic notions that were, arguably nihilistic, and of course they fit in exactly with that of George Bataille's work. But fundamentally, they see the human being not as a divine thing, as a divine object, a sacred symbol of God's love for mankind. Um, but fundamentally, they see it as an object of just pure waste. And for George Hodel, that object of waste was to be turned into a sort of surrealist art piece depicting and
But, like,
evoking the accursed share.
is there not some sort of like how do you say, like kind of an ironic twist in this. Like, why don't they see themselves as waste?
They do.
If you know what I mean. Like, why
They do.
they do?
Yeah, so that's why they believe they survive. Because if this world is of death, they persist within an undead state. This group should have been dead a long, long while ago. It should have went through the various natural cycles that any social organism goes through, but it didn't. Because they believe, like what Hodel believed in a microcosmic sense, is that by them surgically manipulating this body of waste, of course, Elizabeth Short, tragically, is that they could, in fact, create an artistic edifice. Of course, horrific, totally horrific to look at, but an artistic edifice where they could effectively, surgically, what's the word? Surgically persist in an undead state, a state of pure transgression, pure death. Do you know what? Do you know what it's similar to? Here's one thing I can think of that comes to mind just because I was watching these recently. You're aware of the Harry Potter?
Yeah.
Yeah, the idea of the Horcrux, right? Which is that. So the notion is that Tom Riddle, who's Voldemort, he wants to live forever. By the way, Voldemort in French means flight of death, meaning to run from death, right? So this is exactly what they're doing. Effectively, what he does is he kills people, right? And he uses that blood, that horrific transgressive act, to literally cut his soul into pieces and to keep his soul in mundane artifacts. And so these mundane artifacts are hard to find. The Horcrux, this is, are hard to find by the common man, or of course Harry, Hermione, and Ron. So he disguises himself. He divests his soul. He destroys his soul vis-a-vis these transgressive acts and hides it within these mundane artifacts. So it's difficult to find. That's exactly what they've done. To the letter, that's what they've done. Of course, metaphorically speaking. But so what they've done is through the transgressive acts, they've created a sort of perverse Sabbatean Frankist uh, form of love, if you will, intra-group love, a sort of in-group preference, and they've used that to maintain themselves beyond the sort of natural limitations of these social organisms. So in a way, yeah, it's almost like this utilization of the Bataille idea of life as excreto is effectively similar to like what Voldemort did with the Horcruxes. They do the transgressive acts because it permits them to transcend the natural order through inversion. That's why in Kabbalah, you reach heaven by going down to hell. It's so. This is fundamentally, this is the problem with the ruling class, because they have this nihilistic view of the world, this totally inverted view of the world. It's actually a very predatory view of the world as well. We actually cannot even fathom what they're up to, because you actually have to put yourself in that actually horrific mind space to even glimpse the horror of what they're actually busily undertaking. It's I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, but it's mind blowing as well, because, like, I mean, just to try and extrapolate out the point, like with the transgressive act, I mean, somehow they're perpetuating their own existence. Is kind of what you're saying there, kind of more or less, right?
Well, like, it basically creates a false sense of unity amongst those people. It's like any sort of criminal syndicate or what have you. There's a
Mm.
complicity there amongst all the entire group. And this complicity, of course, born of criminal or transgressive acts, effectively it creates an artificial nation, or an artificial feeling of nation. And so it's actually probably one of the strongest feelings you can have, because again, because you're all complicit in these crimes, right? And of course you'll all hang together. You're best off just joining together, you know. So it creates a very strong bond through those means.
And is that the main mechanism of how it works, or is there some other deeper mechanism that it's, I don't know, it's, opening the door into some sort of primal energetic power or something, like the Mayans did with human
Yeah,
sacrifice or something? Is there something else going on deeper that they've found, some wormhole down into the back to the Ein Sof, or back to the middle of creation, and it's this dark chamber that they've, I don't know, black sun within, or whatever you may call it, like like, the terminology gets specious. What I'm really
mm.
trying to ask is, how does it actually work, if you will? If it works at all, how does it work? Or
I believe it's psychological. Flight of Eros
yeah.
perhaps believes something different. You know, that this is materialistic. Of course, once you get,
Well,
yeah, jump in, man.
sorry to cut across you. I remember him briefly, Flight of Eris, in one of the last conversations, and it stuck with me that he said it. He said, we asked him a similar question, and he said, over time he felt this energy sort of began to manifest in a kind of egregoric fashion.
Exactly.
And but he used this term. He said it's physical, and he said by what he meant by the word physical, he meant physical as in composed in a natural manner. However, not something that we would necessarily recognize in our immediate understanding of the fabric of reality. But he did say that, you know what I mean? In other words, it was, how do you say it? Not necessarily supernatural, but certainly outside of our current understanding,
Yeah,
but
yes.
would be as such, eventually and ultimately comprised of natural. It would have a natural composition, as it were, but not one within our understanding. However, I remember he stated that, over time that it would have perhaps this energy would have manifested in an egregoric form, and that they would be in communication with said form, perhaps. And I remember him saying that they were being deceived by it. That was the words he used. That was they were actually themselves in a state of deception from communication with this entity. But this all
Mm.
gets very it's like getting into the Exorcist movie here very quickly. The terrain gets very
Oh, yeah,
but it
absolutely,
almost
yeah.
it almost necessarily, it's just when you speak about these things, like these aberrative practices and this these dark practices that they have, there's a rationale behind why they're doing what they're doing, like, as to try and extrapolate what that is. But I think you hit off it there briefly a second ago. But you said it formed the forming the grouping was one part of it, that it helped them to sort of, yeah, the crux of it. And both you and Flight of Eros kind of hit on this in recent conversations, is that um they subverted this natural process,
Hmm. Yeah,
or they hijacked it, and they've sort of got themselves in a kind of an existential loop where they continue their own existence over the epochs, I
yeah.
assume, and also in a predatory fashion, in that they predate or they feed on the greater human population.
Yeah,
So
they're
it's
they're
like
Death Eaters. To use the Harry Potter term again, they're Death Eaters. Yeah.
Death Eaters.
Yeah, they eat the death. That's effectively, they perpetuate their life upon the feeding of death, by which they they instill and create that death, or that waste, throughout throughout society, through of course the various events that you see. Yeah.
But things like, obviously, then, like, two world wars, for example, would the World War One and World War Two in the 20th century would have been fertile feeding ground for them.
Oh, well, that's the way the economy works. So the accursed share, again, the economy is built on every economy. Well, bar, of course, the traditional economies that don't work on this sort of economy of the ayin, which is double bookkeeping or the sort of capitalistic fiat. Because the money itself is effectively nothingness, that nothingness is
Yeah.
used to represent the something of value, which is that of wealth, productivity, whatever it may be. The only way that you can effectively perpetuate the infinite growth necessary to maintain the sort of phony illusion that you have some sort of structured, rigid semblance of an economy or a society or whatever it may be, so people don't eventually wake up prematurely to the idea of an illusion en masse, that everything is an illusion en masse rather. You have to basically sacrifice mass numbers of people. You have to destroy their land. You have to destroy the infrastructure. You have to destroy the wealth. You basically have to introduce into the system death, so that creates the fertile ground for more growth, artificial growth, but more growth, because they understand the system itself is finite. The value itself is finite. The value that the fiat currency can come to represent itself is, it does have a finite threshold. It's not infinite in scope, even though they can print, if you will, quote, quote, print the money into infinitude, because of course, the money has no value. They still require the destruction, the periodic destruction of wealth, because again, they need to lower the wealth, and in doing so, lower the representative currency to thus stabilize the books. Does that make sense? So that's how they perpetuate. On one, that's just the economic level. That's one way they perpetuate that. Yeah.
No, it seems to me like that. Like when we try to characterize the power structure, as it were, or and I don't like using the term elite because it has the word L in it and eat, but the power structure, as it were, that could we suggest like that effectively, effectively they're in a higher state of consciousness, and I use the term very, very advisedly, higher state, because what I think may happen, right, is that they enter into a sort of a dimensionality that's temporal. What I mean by that is they get into a brief crack. Their consciousness escapes into sort of a brief crack in the, I don't know, in space time, or in consciousness or being or awareness or knowing. And they slip, the light from their being slips momentarily into this crack, as it were. And this crack is only temporal. It only exists it's like a lightning bolt. It only exists for a tiny instant in time, because it's like something that exists in a vacuum in nature. As soon as it exists, um, you know, it's the wrong analogy. Like it's something that exists in a vacuum, because we don't have natural vacuums in nature. But if you can imagine something that exists in a vacuum space, that almost the second it exists, every natural force around it is trying to close it off, because it's an aberration. It's something that's outside the natural order. But when I say higher, what I'm meaning is it's a kind of a manufactured higher, that it's not necessarily some sort of an innate higher order, but by virtue of the fact of their stance and the things they do and their what's around them, they effectively start to get into this manufactured higher state of consciousness, and this gives them perhaps this elite sensibility and perhaps brief insight. Now, when I say higher state, it's like somebody on cocaine might be in a higher state of consciousness in certain ways, or a drug or LSD. So you could argue, well, it's not necessarily a higher state. They're in a state of extreme hubris, for example, or they're in a state of extreme narcissism, or extreme self-absorption, or they're extremely disconnected. They're highly imbalanced in many other ways, shall we say, right? And we would be perhaps higher, as it were, in many other ways. But for this second of this sort of illumination, that their consciousness literally, escapes into this other way of thinking and seeing, and it is essentially like a drug. It's immediately addictive, and they cannot, like, this is what Flight of Eros was hinting at with this deception. The addiction of this new consciousness is a total addiction. It totally devours them. They become devoured by it, and but they can't escape it, and they're deceived thereby. So that's kind of, it's kind of where they're in. It's like once you're in, you can't get out, kind of thing. Once you see things, it's like, the heroin needle. People who've found themselves on that path. Once they've found once the opiate hits their bloodstream and goes through the blood-brain barrier, and they've done it a couple of times, that's it. There's no way back. They're lifelong heroin addicts. It's like similarly to this, what we're talking about here with this group of people.
Well, it's the same.
And
Yeah, please, sorry, man.
no, fine. I like, it's, I use the word illumination on purpose, obviously, because it's connected in with masonry, and that's why I use the word higher state advisedly as well, because it's got that hubristic inherent kind of feel to it, like, but it's also very hierarchical, because they essentially put themselves as the kind of master race, a bloodless race. It's more of like a consciousness race, and I think they feel righteous. They feel like a righteous entitlement that they've been, destined for it, like, as it were. So there's a whole religiosity around it and a fervor around it, and you know that's the sense I have of this group of people, like.
Yeah, well, it's very similar to the idea of strangeness within Mark Twain's The Mysterious Stranger. It's not necessarily it's like of a dark enlightenment. I think that's a sort of neologism of the contemporary world, right? Especially among these tech overlords. But effectively, it's this. There's something about strangeness that, for example, even in Mark Twain's The Mysterious Stranger and the claymation of the adventures of Mark Twain, where this Satan or Lucifer, this mysterious stranger, number 44 as he's sometimes called. Reason for that is the gematria value of blood in Hebrew, which is dam, D-A-M, in anglicized form is 44. So essentially, he is the blood. And what is the blood? The blood is that thing which, like iron, carries the life, but it only carries life through the continual chaotic motion, the continual disruption, from the bottom to the top of the vein, so on and so forth, right? So, the idea of strangeness is pretty much that, which is more. It's more. There's a morbid curiosity that most individuals, especially thinking individuals, have with this strangeness, right? Anything that's strange, really, and it's something that both repels you, but at the same time, the reason it repels you is the same reason that it entices you in, and so effectively, I think that's what's occurred with them. That the void itself is something that is so terrifying, it's so grotesque, but it's also something that's enticed them in to the point where they've actually, if, like what you're saying, they've manifested it in some small way through this sort of egregore, right? So There was a really interesting video I was just trying to find there, and this guy goes over. He goes into this notion of strangeness, and it's something I never thought of, but he speaks of it from a sort of a more moral sense, right? And when the thing with the mysterious stranger, his primary advantage is that fundamentally he has no moral anchor. He he is the shadow, that is, you know, it's untethered from the light. He is both, in fact, of the light and the shadow. So he exists within this, this sort of completely boundless or unabridged state where he can effectively do whatever needs to be done to affect life, to even affect his own will onto the world. And I think for them that is highly, highly, it's intoxicating, it's enticing. Especially think about it. See if you're a small nation, right? And you're within an arid environment where nothing grows and your neighbors call you the boors of the mountains, that you build nothing of your own, you do nothing of your own. And let's say you come across this very perplexing yet intriguing idea that in fact you don't need to create anything to produce wealth. You can actually produce wealth through nothingness. And in fact, if you give your entire soul over to the nothingness, you can actually gain a certain freedom, a sense of freedom in that nothingness. In fact, you can become the masters of your own destiny within nothingness, right? Within the void. Because you're bound to nothing. Hence, of course, the nothingness. You're not bound to any moral code. That which hampers all the other nations that surround you. So you literally actually have no obstacle, because fundamentally you're both ephilistic and you're solipsistic, but it's solipsism and ephilism, which is basically an anti-life, antinomianism, against the law, against the inversion of the natural order. It's one that is a weaponized variant. It's not one that would destroy the individual per se. It's one that actually empowers the individual. So this is why, of course, I mean, all the way back to the description of the Asuras. Again, this sort of philosophical thread that just it meanders its way through human history. You see the Asuras being claimed as, or described rather, as a group of whom hates all of humanity, and of whom all of humanity hates. A vehicle of decay, of literally the personification of chaos itself. And as you've seen, I mean, there's a power in that strangeness. They are strange, but there's also limitations in that too, because fundamentally this only goes so far. Everything eventually must come to an end. Even well, for example, with back to Voldemort, even Voldemort had his weaknesses. Even Voldemort couldn't see every single potentiality. And of course, that hubris that he could led to his demise, because fundamentally, human beings are still mortal. We're still fallible. And though we may believe that we dwell, within this sort of a transcendental state, through transgression, of course, in this case, fundamentally, we still can't see all potentialities. We don't have the looking glass just yet. Perhaps they do, I don't know. But I think there is a limitation to their power. Yeah. You also see it. I mean, for example, I don't know if you want to go into Dahmer. I could mention some things on Dahmer you may find of interest. And this also, by the
Well,
way, ties in with this too.
yeah. I think just before we do though, it's like this final point about this subjectivity of this moral or amoral you know, deeds. Like, so if you take this group that have subverted the natural order, as it were, but like that's their free will to do that as such. So, you know, we can argue that they've broken the moral code. They're acting immorally, essentially. But, you know, we're living in a sort of a world where there's no lightning striking them down as such, as it were, in the immediate sense. You know, okay, we may argue separately that eventually they'll bring about their own demise by being so wildly out of balance. But, you know, in the immediate sort of day to day sense, you know, they've made leaps and bounds. For example, throughout the, you know, we mentioned from Cromwell up to the 20th century and beyond, you know, in terms of monopolizing control. So, but the reason I'm saying is that they are living in a universe, as are we, where they have made good, you know, for where they want to go, and they have enabled themselves and empowered themselves. So the point I'm trying to make is, like, are they living in a more real world than perhaps we are? Real, by real I mean that, like, you could counter argue that they're not the ones who are under the illusion. We are, like, the greater social, perhaps maybe not yourself and myself and people who are listening who are maybe have seen through some of this stuff, but the wider societal population is ironically, they're the ones under the hypnosis. They're not living in a real universe, as it were. They're living in the smoke and mirrors world.
Absolutely.
And but but you could argue that the wider social population haven't necessarily disintegrated into this moral abyss, amoral abyss. But then, to go back to the earlier point of the conversation, you could say absolutely they have. Look at the 20th century. You know, these were all the men and women of Middle America, Middle Ireland, Middle England that fought in the trenches of World War One, that went to the Somme, that went to Vietnam, you know, that shot kids in Vietnamese villages, that created all sorts of heinous acts, uh, you know, across Europe, into Russia, you know, etc., in Ireland. And so you look at the ordinary population, and we have this narrative that, you know, this power structure is preying on us. But when you look at it, when you flip it and you go, hang on a minute, we're no angels either. Like, you know, we ourselves are also praying, if you will. Like, we're also morally sort of broken in many ways. And, you know, even in the day to day thing, we, you know, as you're mentioning, the serial killer phenomenon, or, you know, murder in the social sense, and you look at the stats, and it's like, you know, it's shocking that, you know, this is among us anyway. You know, these kind of factors. Um, so, like, you know, you can flip the argument, like, you know, almost, you know, if you had them in court, for example, if you had the power structure in court right now in front of a jury, and they were going to, you know, they're guilty or not guilty, this is an immoral power structure who have caused great harm and are essentially evil. And if they're convicted, they get a life in prison, or they get the chair or whatever. But we're trying to defend them. Imagine, if you will, we're the defense attorney. We're defending the power structure, and we would say, well, Your Honor, look at the society. Look what the society has done. It's the society, the ordinary man on the street who has gone to war. He's pulled the trigger, you know, so he is culpable, like, as well. But we constantly have this almost completely accepted narrative that this power structure is preying on us, and we're off the hook. We're innocent, and we, you know, so it's like, when you think about it, it's not so straightforward in some senses.
Oh no, absolutely not. No, well, as well. Again, these people know themselves, right? They understand that they are, as we all are. All of us are amoral in some sense, right? There's parts of us, of course, because we're a fractured tapestry of psychic pieces, you know, which fit together loosely into this sort of mosaic that we call the psyche. And of course, we express ourselves through that, but and there's various layers to that too, right? All the way to the persona or the mental character. But fundamentally, there's a part of people that is of this strangeness. It's of this void. This is a monster. This is vicious. And the problem is, a lot of people in society, they don't want to face up to that. They actually don't want to face up to the fact that they are apex predators, or they could be. They have the potential to be. So what they end up doing is they try to sort of curtail that. They suppress it. They bottle up. By the way, this is also what leads to neurotic behaviors during the symptomatic collapse and decline of societies, because the society prides itself on this hyper real, meaning hyper reality. It's not real, from the Latin rea, which is a thing or matter, that which exists. It also links, by the way, to the notion of real, which is where we get our word royal. So it's the king, the apex, the canopy, the actual reality, the thing which is tangible, that rules over everything else. They don't have that. Their reality exists in their mind. It's an aberration of what they are in fact, actually witnessing beyond the lenses that have either been inculcated in them or are the product of their own self-delusions. So they don't know themselves, fundamentally. I've mentioned it before as well. The reason I can sort of piece this all together and I can figure out what these, I can somewhat, I mean, of course, I'm not bragging, I haven't figured out even 1/10 of what the hell's going on, but I figured out a fair amount just based on really primarily intuition. I don't read a great deal. I know that probably sounds insane to most people, but most of the stuff that I ingest informationally is either audiobooks, videos, and I have read certain books, but it's not really reading, it's more skim reading. I'll skim read it to find specific quotes that I've seen from other things, and I piece it all together that way. So a lot of it's intuition. And the reason I can sort of intuit it is because, well, it's exact. If I wanted to rule the world, this is exactly what I would do, down to the
But
letter, And the reason I can empathize with that is because there's a part of all of us, including myself, which, we could become a monster, Of course we don't,
yeah,
because we can control ourselves. Perhaps these people have less control over their more regressive impulses, should we say. But we have to acknowledge the fact that man is not this one-dimensional civilized character. No one is.
no.
It's this, we're a multifaceted being that is capable of all manner of things, So I think that's why I agree with your assessment there. Individuals in the wider society really live in a hyper reality that's conjured by the people that are actually living in reality. And in that sense, yeah, it is absolutely they exist on a physical plane. It's material. They deal in actually what exists, you know? And of course, if we deal in figments of our own imagination, or of course, of an imagination that was inculcated into us, then of course they're going to control us. It's just, it's the way the cookie crumbles,
But this idea about this higher state of consciousness or illumination
Yeah.
is simply that they've grasped these concepts on a real deep and kind of instinctive manner, and they've come to know how things work on this level, and how they can manipulate things. Like this. It's not to say that they're brainier or anything like that. It's just that they've had this eureka moment,
Yeah.
where they realize the realization, the lightning bolt, the illumination comes in. They go, and it's part of their cult, as it were. And you use this term to know that themselves, and variously you can. Myself, I think they know themselves. This is the instinct I have in the Greek sense. Know thyself. I think they have the full awareness, but I think they've taken the left-hand path, as it were. But to them, they themselves don't look at it that way, because part of the illumination is it's this moral subjectivity. They no longer see it as, if anything, like they feel they have to break this moral code in order to get into this illuminated state of mind. It's part of this transgression.
Yes. Yeah. Well. I mean, it's. Sorry, man. Please.
No, no. But the final point, and this is kind of gone a little bit left of field again, but like, to develop, counter develop Flight of Eros's point, are they in communication with some sort of egregoric energy form that has sort of, over the millennia or centuries or whatever, has taken on a form, and they're essentially in communication with it, and it is essentially deceiving them, because it's telling them that you can operate ultimately and eternally and infinitely outside of the natural order, and they've bought that hook, line, and sinker.
Mhm.
But they don't see it leads to their eventual demise. But anyway, the point I want to make is: are we, right, by speaking right now on this call about the power structure, are we sort of creating an egregoric form of them? Because I dare say that we are. What's your feeling on that?
Well, actually, it really I think it's chapter 11 of The Mysterious Stranger, and it effectively answers this, I think. So it deals with the impossible nature of reality and the non-existence of the other, right? So, for example, we read, quote, "Strange indeed that you should not have suspected that your universe and its contents were only dreams, visions, fiction, strange because they are so frankly and hysterically insane, like all dreams." And then it goes on to state, quote, "I myself have no existence." This is the mysterious stranger mentioning this. "I am but a dream, your dream, creature of your imagination. I shall dissolve into the nothingness out of which you made me." Quote, "Nothing exists except, pardon me, nothing exists save empty space in you, and you are not you. You have no body, no blood, no bones. You're but a thought. A god," quote, "a god who could have made every one of them happy, yet never made a single happy one, who mouths morals to other people and has none himself. You perceive now that these things are impossible except in a dream." And then it goes on to state, "It is all a dream, a grotesque and foolish dream. Nothing exists but you, and you're but a thought, a vagrant thought, a useless thought, a homeless thought, wandering forlorn amongst the empty eternities." Now, again, that doesn't have to be real, but if you believe that to be the case, how does that change your thinking? If you believe that, for example, the God that you create, let's say in this case Satan, right? That is the egregore that you're in contact with over the millennia, over the centuries, that you believe in some part of your consciousness that exists and is real. But of course, perhaps subconsciously or consciously, or another part of your consciousness, you realize that, in fact, it's just an egregore to empower us, a sort of mental talisman, which
Mm.
has emerged from our own sort of our own psyche, and and in time will, of course, dissolve back into that nothingness. And this is that reality itself is a dream that we can become lucid to the impossible nature of, and thus bend it to our will, right? Like magic, if you will. And we can do that through, of course, the perceptual vehicle of our mind, and coalescing those perceptual vehicles in a way through, for example, hyperreality, making people believe through mental trickery, uh, something, uh, make them believe something that is completely false is real, right? Eventually that will become reality in some small way. I say a small way, a way in which it affects their mind, right? It doesn't have to exist, but tangibly speaking, but they believe it exists tangibly. So you can control people vis-a-vis this way, and you can actually recreate society that way, or reality
Yeah.
that way. Not at the fundamental substrata level, but you can you can create reality vis-a-vis the sort of veil you put over it, right? Through those means. So yeah, effectively that's it. That's what they've done. It's not I don't see. I don't think they're in contact with anything. I I I think that they are what they see as God or the dweller in the abyss is this weird terrain, this weird sort of self-referential terrain of that which is them at a deep level, but has been externalized. It's their shadow externalized, if you will, right? It is the strangeness externalized. It is their ideas of the impossible, confounding nature of reality externalized. And through these ideas of the impossible, of the confounding nature of reality, plus the non-existence of their own self, that actually frees them. Where people would read The Mysterious Stranger, for example, and become filled with existential dread. Oh my God, what happens when you die? And oh my God, we're just a thought, so no afterlife. And for them, it's an empowerment. They see it as like the shackles have been unleashed from their Promethean mind, and they can basically run wild, you know? I don't know if that answers your question, man.
Mm. Well, to me, it's like a very, you know, how do I explain it, man? It's like nearby where I am. There's a woods, and right in the middle of the woods is a lake. The lake is kind of like oval shaped, and it's like when I hear you speak about these things, and I try to imagine these things, it's like on a windy night, that surface of that dark lake. And I did used to walk up there around there actually at night because it was really beautiful. But at times I catch the moon on the surface of the lake reflected on the night lake, and once in a while I'd see it, and maybe through the trees or through the cresting water, the way it was moving, it'd kind of evaporate and disappear and then reform. And you know what I mean, as I walked. And it's similar to that. Every once in a while I can kind of grasp, I get it, like, and then it's elusive, it's like, but that's why I use this term almost like higher consciousness, because I think they trip into this on a full-time basis, like, and I think when we speak about these things, maybe you have a lot more of a clearer version of it than, or maybe we all have sort of effervescent mercurial
Mm.
sort of relationships. It's very conceptual, very kind of abstract. Your mind actually needs to go into a whole other gear to speak about this stuff. So, but I think they may be absolutely more in the resonant field of these things, and it's part of the power that they have. So, it's a kind of an inverted enlightenment that they have. Inverted, I mean, it's
Yeah.
like morally inverted, perverted, kind of a dark enlightenment that they have or have had or are having. You know what I mean? And as it goes back over, or perhaps over epochs, over the millennia. I don't know. How long they've. But like what you said there, some of it, I mean, is like that. I get the moon. I can see the moon reflected at times, and other times it just, because I think it's necessarily removed from us, really, like,
Hmm.
because we are not them, I suppose. Or perhaps we are in many ways, in many ways we can be, but then you get into this kind of a subjective thinking, and philosophizing that becomes, abstract. I'm not saying you, but one does. and
Yeah.
and but one is, at the end of the day, one is left back in the chair in one's house, and one has to go to work in the morning, and one has to live in the world. And deal with the culture around them, and it just everything is like your face hits the concrete again, and that's what gives you your position vis-a-vis all of this, like, all of what we're speaking about. So, but it's I don't know, it's a difficult thing to understand, and like even by virtue, I'm not sure if the wider society could ever understand it. I mean, I've been trying to think about it a long time, and I can't. I get glimpses of it, and where I think, all right, I can kind of feel it. Actually,
Mhm.
when you speak about it, there, it's like an invocation, and the invocation is the spirit of them, of what we perceive to be, or what we've elucidated to be them. And actually, Flight of Eros, he had this. What was the term he used again, Silas? Not the invagination, but the force that comes from the sun. Do you remember the word he used?
The
He used with a P, no?
I forget the term now. Um,
Imagination. It was
Perturbation.
some perturbation, right? And like, it's like this word perturbation. I had a little look at it, and there's a mathematical, like, there's a number of different manifestations of that word, and one of them is actually a kind of a mathematical concept. It's used in maths, and this ties in with what you said earlier on about how you'd effectively elucidated, or kind of had, over by nearly a process of elimination and a process of deduction over time, developed begin to understand this power structure and how they operate. But the perturbation thing in mathematics is like, you start off with a problem that you cannot solve, right? You accept it. Uh, the answer, x is an amount of unknown and unknowable quantity. So x cannot be solved. The answer to a given equation, x is of unknowable quantity or unknowable solution. So what the perturbation in the mathematics is, you scale down and you create a new equation, and the new equation deals in quantities that you do know, that you can establish, and so the perturbation equation, you are able to come up with an answer, right? And what they do then is, from the unknown x of unknown value, and the subsequent equation, the perturbation, where you came up with a value y, will say, of now you of a known quantity. And what they do to get the unknown is they force a resolution between x and y.
Yes, exactly.
And that's essentially what you've done. I think all of us have attempted to do over time. Is it's one of the time immemorial question: who are they? Like, or what is their characteristic, or what is the scenario? And I think we attempted to force the values between x and y, known and unknown, based on what we've elucidated, and you know. But anyway, not to get too far off the point. Um, yeah, you asked me. There's just a wider question there of an insight into a kind of a power group and a way of thinking that I think we get glimpses of, and I think it resonates somehow. It resonates as if, I think it's like walking into the wizard's chamber. You get the feeling there's a certain vibration in there, and a scent, and there's certain accoutrements and paraphernalia, and kind of there's a certain light in there, and it kind of resonates. You kind of feel it, like. So that's what I get from when you speak about their characteristics.
That's what I also felt when I was sort of beginning to think and ponder these ideas as well. It's um yeah, they're I don't know. It's like it intuitively makes sense. Not necessarily, it
Mm,
doesn't necessarily make sense from a point of view of this is how reality is, right? And I totally agree with your fear as well, that perhaps, by us talking about this, we're actually in a way projecting this reality forth. We become an unwitting node for their reality.
mm,
But it explains exactly what they're doing. Almost, it's like the key to understanding what they're doing. I just, for me, there's no way to even fathom what we see throughout history, of course, even what we see in the contemporary world, and all that they do without actually understanding these key concepts. Funnily enough, actually, this thing also pops up in I Pet Goat too, through, of
Mm,
course, the symbolism. That idea of the F equals minus F, which is, I believe, Newton's third law of thermodynamics. Every force must have a equal and opposite reactive force, which acts against it. So yeah, it effectively it's written into that too. By the way, Isaac Newton was a Kabbalist as well. He died with
yeah.
more tomes on Kabbalah than he did with mathematical tomes or geometric tomes on geometry or anything like that. So you've also you've also got that idea. I mean, it's literally written into the fabric of everything that we look at and see. So the problem is, fundamentally, is this just part of the hyper reality? Is because it's almost like they want you to think that the world is like this, that the world is built on chaos, it's built on death. And I actually disagree. I disagree with it because you actually see the glimmer of light, the I guess you could call it the glimmer of hope in basic human behavior and interactions when it's not being
Yeah.
force fed and funneled through these sort of psychic chambers of grotesque abuse and manipulation. So I think they also want people to believe that everything is just predatory, and that's not the case. I think there's a balance here within reality, but they just, again, for them, their power exists in in projecting that reality as well, right? Too, yeah.
But another angle on it is that, like, the manifestation of their will that we see, which is predatory, and we argue it's largely destructive, sadistic, and sort of morally inverted. That may not be their primary um, manifestation of their will, in the same sense that, like, the primary manifestation of our will here is to deduce or elucidate, inquire, um, and learn essentially about the world around us. But they're and but we argue just there that perhaps as an artifact of that inquiry, that manifestation of our will, we may somehow begin to create this egregoric them, or we may feed energy toward their creation of them as a group, and may somehow sort of psychically enable or bolster their existence. But to use a similar sort of train of thought, that maybe they are not necessarily, they haven't embarked on a sort of a sadistic campaign to destroy us all as their primary motive, but their primary motivation really is this Ein Sof sort of, what you've been discussing earlier on in the conversation, this attraction to this death energy as a way to self propel or self propagate themselves. And that's very much a primary direction of theirs. But the outcome of that is this manifestation of this sadistic and nefarious, dark kind of left hand path that we find ourselves on. You know what I mean? That it's a natural outcome of their initial instinct, like, rather than the initial instinct in itself.
Yeah, it's a
That
a byproduct. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. But for us, it becomes very much obviously the only show in town because it's an existential threat to us as such. And but I have the feeling that their minds are focused on some other mechanism.
Mhm.
this deeper mechanism is their focus, and that is, and all of what happens around that is secondary, very very much secondary, or even tertiary. It's by decree away from what they're actually looking at. But what they're actually looking at, this lightning bolt of enlightenment into this thing, has a sort of, because I still believe they're human. Like, otherwise, how would you explain that they have
Mhm.
completely abandoned any morsel of moral uh, moral sensibility or moral balance? Like, you'd have to argue that they are complete and utter total psychopaths, and I feel that's a little bit sort of dramatic, because I feel ultimately they must be. I mean, they're still of human form, for example. They still come from mothers and have fathers and have daughters and have sons. They still, even if you bring it down to its most calculated form, they still wish to exist. So they still must sustain a bloodline. So in that bloodline, they can't become like, you know, I walk down the hall and I kill my mother and I kill my father. They're not. If they were completely psychopathic, they would kill themselves. In other words, destroy their own people. So what I'm trying to say is that they must have some morsel of balance. Otherwise, that destructive impulse would have themselves destroyed by now, and all of us completely, like, annihilated the entire race,
Mhm.
like. So you know what I mean. It doesn't, to
Yeah,
me, it doesn't add up that they're necessarily inherently psychopathic in the true sense, like, in the.
I think as well the psychopathy. It's yeah, they're not. I mean, they're not maniacs. Perhaps they are
Yeah.
psychopaths, but I mean, this sort of maniacal nature to the psychopath. It's not that. In fact, the psychopath is sort of I would say it's predicated on control. The archetype is predicated on control, even the disorder. So it's one that's not necessarily, it itself has a natural um sort of a balancing point to it. Of course, it's
Hmm.
to our ideas, our sort of perspective. That balancing point is a skewed one, but again, that's just based upon our perspective, right? Of course, because we, like what you're saying, we're looking at this like we're prey. That's the problem as well. So we naturally subordinate ourselves in our perspective. Um,
Mm.
and that's not necessarily saying we should become the predator. But I think, yeah, we need to take a more balanced view of it. We have to see things on a multifaceted um, sort of level or view, because ultimately, uh, it's not. Again, you also made the very good point, which is that the prey, which of we are right within the system. Honestly, the prey sort of frets, and its entire world becomes consumed by, you know, abstractly thinking about the predator and what the predator's doing and how the predator's going to get us. That eventually what you end up doing is sort of exciting yourself into the paralysis of fear. So that's
Hmm.
another problem as well. And by fear as well, fear has a projective quality to it. So, we actually project the shadow of the predator in all that we do. So
Hmm.
fundamentally, we actually, firstly, we establish ourselves and entrench ourselves in the sort of prey mentality because of this oppositional state that we have ourselves in. And secondly, of course, we enter a state of learned helplessness because we feel like, like any fear, we big up the monster to another worldly, magnitude that we just feel powerless compared to it. And yeah, I think we have to. We don't have to be prey in our mentality. You know, we might be prey socially, pardon me, socio-economically, but we don't have to be prey psychologically. I think we have to understand the predator. We don't necessarily have to be the predator. And yeah, like what you're saying, they are multifaceted. It's not necessarily like they're just totally violent psychopaths. They are still human, absolutely. And like every human, there's gray areas, right? The human being is it's a nuanced being of pure character, right? One that can't be measured, because if it could have been measured, they would have already recreated it long, long ago. So it can't be measured; it can only be steered, and because it can only be steered, that tells you they are in fear of it in some sense, and they also can't wield it fully. It's like the rancher with the buffalo herd or the cattle herd. You don't lead from the front. You lead from the sides and you try and steer the thing. Because fundamentally, if that thing stampedes you, you're not going to stop it. You have no power over it, really, other than your manipulatable skills, right? Or power. So, um, yeah, I think that's we have to understand that as well. That these people also have families. They also, in fact, it's the love of their family itself, even though their sort of family and tribe is born of these transgressive, sort of psychologically, what would you say, sort of psychologically inverted loopholes, to create these super tribes, if you will, these tribes that can't be broken or are impervious to outside interference. That it's and entropy as well. We have to still understand that they have this complex array of feelings. You know, they are still human. They still love. They still hate. They still, There's of course the psychopathy, pardon, aspect of it is that they are cold and calculated. They have no
Yeah,
when it comes
from
to their
our perspective.
yes, and when it comes to their enemies, they're cold and calculating. They have there's no they have empathy, as in they can relate to the prey on the level that is required to destroy that prey, to thus, in a sort of uh, time horizon sense, or through chronoreceptivity, like what Flight of Eros was mentioning, to understand where their prey is going to go, so they can keep 10 steps
Yeah,
ahead of it. They have empathy on that sense, but they have no sympathy. They are
yeah.
merciless. So, and that comes
They're
from
they're probably less like hunters than they are like farmers at this stage. They're farmers of human beings. Because a hunter is like, you've got to go up in the woods or up the mountain somewhere, and hopefully you find a deer. But like the farmer just walks out into the farm, and there the human beings are in the shed, or they're in the fenced paddock. Like they have it down to a fine art. So they're farming humanity, like for the kill, as it were.
absolutely, yeah.
And like they have the same instinct perhaps that the farmer has around cattle that are going to be slaughtered. After a while it becomes, it's just part of the job. You know what I mean? It's like they don't even necessarily, it doesn't necessarily resonate. It becomes them, like, when the farmer sends off his bullocks, the meat truck comes to bring them to the mart, and they get the humane killer, and they're eventually you go to McDonald's, and there it is sitting in a with a wrapper around it. You're not thinking about that whole process, they're similarly, wired. They've grown up in that world where that's normalized for them. Like, perhaps they have empathy within their own group, but for everything else outside the city walls, it's fodder. That it's for annihilation. Like, and it just they just look at it as, well, this is what we have to do.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
You know, this,
Absolutely. I mean, yeah. That's. I mean, that's the pretty much the most effective way of describing it through analogy. Is yeah, absolutely. I think that's super. And the problem is, we're still in the hunter mindset. I mean, we go out to work. We're effectively hunting. We're giving our time away to hunt the great beast of, financial freedom. And it's an elusive beast, it's a mammoth that one can never trap or take down. Um,
Yeah.
but funnily enough, somebody left a very, very insightful comment, and it was a quote, and it was from StephBot, whatever StephBot is, but quote, human society cannot be rationally understood until it is seen for what it is, a series of farms in which human farmers own human livestock. And
Yeah.
you see the same thing with the Irish famine. And I have certain very poignant and germane quotes, and I want to just get your general sense of them. They're actually quite shocking quotes as well. Um, so we see within, of course, the Irish, I believe it was called the Gorta Mór, which was the Great
Yeah.
Hunger, the Irish famine, the bad times, and it caused Ireland's population to fall by between 20 and 25%, and as many as 5 million people died, and several million emigrated, as we mentioned, and it went on from 1845 to 1852. And as you mentioned, there was similar things going on in Scotland with a blight there as well. And it states here, I'll just try and read some of the quotes that I put down, noted down. Here we go. So, in the 40 years that followed the Union, successive British governments grappled with the problems of governing a country which had, as Benjamin Disraeli put it in 1844, quote, a starving population, an absentee aristocracy, an alien church, and in addition, the weakest executive in the world. And he goes on to state, without exception, their findings prophesied disaster. This was in reference to a special committee that was developed to inquire into the state of Ireland in between 1801 and 1845. Um, Ireland, and it stated Ireland was on the verge of starvation, her population rapidly increasing, three-quarters of her labourers unemployed, housing conditions appalling, and the standard of living unbelievably low. So that was the general sense of Ireland at the time within the British establishment. Of course, Benjamin Disraeli is also, as he was a Zionist as well prior, I guess a proto-Zionist, right? But a Kabbalist too. But we also see as well from several individuals regarding the death toll in Ireland. And hold on, I'm just looking for the quotes here. Um, yeah, here we go. So, John Mitchell, one of the leading writers in the social and political movement known as Young Ireland, in an article called English Rule, that was carried in a November 1846 edition of The Nation, wrote that the Irish people were, quote, expecting famine day by day, and that they attributed it collectively not to the rule of heaven, as to the greedy and cruel policy of England. And he continued in the same article, the people as they sat starving watched heavy laden ships freighted with the yellow corn their own hands have sown and reaped, spreading all sail for England. And we go on to read from Mitchell as well, who, by the way, was I believe, convicted for sedition because of this article. An island which is said to be an integral part of the richest empire on the globe should in 5 years lose 2.5 million of its people, more than 1/4 by hunger and fever, the consequence of hunger and flight beyond sea to escape from hunger. And of course, you see the same thing in America right now with the homelessness and, well, starvation as well, right? Um, and then he mentioned, I have called it an artificial famine, that is to say, it was a famine which desolated a rich and fertile island that produced every year abundance and superabundance to sustain all her people and many more. The English indeed call the famine a dispensation of providence and ascribe it entirely to the blight on potatoes, but potatoes failed in like manner all over Europe. Yet there was no famine save in Ireland. The British account of the matter then is first a fraud, second a blasphemy. The Almighty indeed sent the potato blight, but the English created the famine. And we also find as well from several British, and I use British loosely really because a lot of these people were actually involved in the creation of Israel as well, right? Um, so their loyalties were, we'll say their loyalties were dual in nature, should we say? But they mention that. Oh God, hold on. I'm trying to find the quote here. Here we go. So Sir Charles Trevelyan. I don't know if you're familiar with.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Trevelyan's corn.
Trevelyan. Yes,
Yeah, if you heard the song, there's an Irish song, "The Fields of Athenry." Low
yes.
lie the fields of Athenry.
Favorite
They
one of
sold
my.
Sir Trevelyan's corn, so the young will see the morn. And it's about the famine. And yeah, go on about Trevelyan. Trevelyan is linked in with like the food. The remaining food in Ireland was forcibly exported to Britain, and the public here were forcibly starved to death.
Yes,
That's what happened,
that's.
and that's widely known here in Ireland by anyone. Any of the people I know, for example, who are students of history or interested in what they know what happened. We were fucking forcibly starved
Mhm.
to death by the powers that be in England back in the day. Um,
Cecil Woodham Smith also mentioned that in The Great Hunger, Ireland, 1845 to 1849. He stated, the indisputable fact that huge quantities of food were exported from Ireland to England throughout the period when the people of Ireland were dying of starvation. And Trevelyan, so Trevelyan's the one actually. He was a Philo Semite, if you will. He loved the idea of Israel, and he was involved very
mm,
heavily in British Israelitism, which was a proto-Zionist cause for the creation of a Jewish state
well,
to fulfill
don't
Masonic and Kabbalistic.
like if you take it like that up to the late 1500s, England was in a civil war.
Mm,
So England itself, forget about Ireland for a sec. Just look at England. England was caught up in its own civil war. There was bloodshed on English territory between whatever the Roundheads and the Royalists. Is that right, Silas?
aye.
Yeah. So between those two groupings, so you had England itself was in turmoil. And next thing, against that backdrop, you look at Ireland. By the time Cromwell eventually arrived over in Ireland, Ireland was already like gone through a period of some 500 years of endemic warfare. Before he ever showed up, the place was, I mean, war torn. The country was literally war torn for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Then he shows up, and by the way, here in County Clare, and I need to look into this again. There was when Cromwell came into County Clare, right? Some of his English enemies formed an English battalion and came after him into Ireland, and they met him here in County Clare. They met his forces here somewhere in County Clare, and to fight him. So that'll tell you, like you can imagine. Oh, here comes Oliver fucking Cromwell, like to give us a serious pain in the head here, like, and hot on his heels is yet another band of Englishmen who are
Mhm.
trying to kill him. So that'll tell you sort of like the way things were at the time. And actually, I was just up the north a couple of days ago. I was up actually in the Giants Causeway, and there's a guy up there who's got a basically he's got it's like a kind of little one of these zoo kind of. It's open to the public, and what
Mhm.
he's got in there is wolves. He's got wolves, Irish wolves,
All right, yeah.
and they're kept in captivity. But there's a little sign there, and on the sign to give some of the history. Wolves were native in Ireland up to whatever,
Hmm.
up to actually when Cromwell was here, and Cromwell issued a kind of an edict where he would pay so many shillings for a bitch wolf and so many shillings for a male wolf or whatever it was, and he put a bounty on him, and the last of the wolves were killed in Ireland as a result of Cromwell's bounty. But not notwithstanding, the wolf itself, sort of, which in Irish is Mac Tira, son of the land, it was a kind of there's an instinctive, emblematic character in the landscape that had to be kind of stamped out because it
Yeah.
represented a kind of a spiritual aspect of the Irish psyche, or the old order, as were. But anyway, I don't know how I got sidetracked onto that, but the famine, yeah, food was forcibly exported. Cromwell arrives in, and you know, the wider thing is, I'm still unsure about how did Ireland present such an issue to England for so
Well,
long. How did
it
this is
wasn't
what I
just
don't fully understand.
England. See, this is the thing with you actually see it today. See this whole war going on between well, sort of, well, yeah, it is essentially a war, a sort of the militant, hostile nature between the states of Ireland and Israel. That's something that goes all. I don't know why. I don't try to make sense of it. Because I mean the Alexandrians were in the crosshairs of this same sort of group, right? And again, I'm not saying Jews. It's again this minority of a minority, which is Kabbalists, and they do have designs on world domination. It's I mean it's a fact. It's just clear from both the historical record and the contemporary evidence. Um, but Cromwell was an agent of them. So, by the way, so
Yeah,
was Sir Charles Trevelyan. As
yeah,
I mentioned, he had dual loyalties, to say the very least, and they were all Freemasons. Every one of them was a Freemason,
yeah,
and well, for example, of course, Oliver Cromwell wasn't. He was just a direct agent. Um, the Civil War. It was taking its course. The year was, pardon me, 1647. It started in 1642. He came over to Ireland and around about that time. And then you had later on in 1691 the Williamite Wars after the Glorious Revolution. So you had also that issue too in Ireland. But Naseby has been won and lost. The king is virtually a prisoner, Charles I, while treated as an honoured guest at Holmby House, according to a letter published in plain English on the 3rd of September 1920. Pardon me. Um, I've put the incorrect date there. It'll probably be sometime in the 17th century anyway. Oh no, sorry. This is from a plain English letter dated on the 3rd of September 1921 about these events that occurred, of course, 300 years prior. And quote, the learned elders have been in existence for a much longer period than they have perhaps suspected. My friend Mr. L.D. van Valkert of Amsterdam has recently sent me a letter containing 2 extracts from the synagogue at Mulheim. The volume in which they are contained was lost at some period during the Napoleonic Wars and has recently come into Mr. van Valkert's possession. It is written in German and contains extracts of letters sent and received by the authorities of the Mulheim Synagogue. The first entry he sends me is of a letter received the 16th of June 1647 from OC, right? Obviously meaning Oliver Cromwell, by Ebenezer Pratt. Quote, in return for financial support, so this is the command that they're given to Oliver Cromwell. In return for financial support, will advocate admission of Jews to England. This, however, impossible while Charles is Charles living. Charles cannot be
yeah,
executed without trial. Adequate grounds
yeah,
for which to do not at present exist. Therefore, advise that Charles be assassinated, but will have nothing to do with arrangements for procuring an assassin, though willing to help in his escape. And then the reply to it, 2OC by E. Pratt. So the previous one was Oliver Cromwell. Quote, will grant financial aid as soon as Charles removed and Jews admitted. Assassination too dangerous. Charles shall be given opportunity to escape. His recapture will make trial and execution possible. the support will be liberal, but useless to discuss terms until trial commences. So basically, what happened was they allowed Charles to escape Holmby House, of which he was a guest there. I mean, he was under house arrest effectively. And what this would do is would permit the sort of legal pretext for them to indict Charles, Charles the First
Yeah.
of Stuart, under indict him under charges of treason, um, and what have you, and that would allow them to execute him as quickly as just quickly as possible. You actually
Yeah.
see it with Oliver, pardon me, Oliver Cromwell. No one would sign the. Of course, who the hell is going to kill the king? Your soul would rot
Yeah.
in hell forever. The belief was the divine right of rule. But Oliver
Mm,
Cromwell had enough support that basically he just ousted the people that wouldn't sign it, and he signed it alone. And this is why
ah,
the English hated him so much, because they realized he wasn't actually English. He wasn't fighting for English ideas. He was a Puritan.
yeah.
He was the people who would go on to basically found America after they using bioweapons
Yeah.
wiped out the Native
Yeah.
Americans. He was
Yeah.
they had a belief in Zionism, effectively, had the belief
Yeah.
that Jerusalem had to be recreated, the third temple had to be recreated, and
Yeah.
all of
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
So that's why the English fought him. And by the way, and regarding Charles Trevelyan, sorry to go on for a bit, man, but just really interesting here. He stated, so he was in charge of the administration of government relief to the victims of the Irish famine, limited the government's actual relief because, as he claimed, quote, the judgment of God sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson. And then he goes on to
Yeah.
state, uh, he said that he saw the famine as a mechanism for reducing surplus population. That's the accursed share principle. And then he mentions,
Yeah.
quote, the real evil with which we have to contend is not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the Irish people. And then he mentions, oh yeah, here we go. Trevelyan, of course, was a Zionist before Zionism, of course, was actually
Yeah.
formalized by Theodor Herzl. He proposed way back in the half of the 19th century that the Jews should be given a home in East Africa, i.e., Palestine. So
Yeah. Yeah. Who said that? Trevelyan.
Trevelyan, yeah, he was a major
Oh,
proponent.
hell.
So there's a
I
connection
didn't know
here
that.
between all of this.
I didn't know that.
So they need to get rid of the Irish for some particular reason. In fact, if you look to this day, there's a hatred among, of course, this is even before Ireland came out, so fervently against Israel. I mean,
Well, just on
mm,
that, like, there's the dialectical is at work there as well. This anti-Israel, support Palestine. This is a separate matter now, but we've had this going on in all our streets. Save Palestine, save Palestine. They're anti-Israel, but this was a Sinn Féin thing. This is a manipulation as well. Like, this is just stirring up the dialectical, and it's trying to eventually lead into kind of anti-Semitism, I think. And like, we're all perplexed as to how all this anti-Israel protests happen on our streets all over Ireland in the last 6 to 8 months. But looking into some of the characters who are fomenting these protests, they're all controlled. Like, they're coming from sort of the feminazi camp. They're coming from Sinn Féin. They're coming from the left, and they're controlled.
yeah,
But that's not to say that even outside of that, there is a weird dynamic there between Israel or Judaism, really, and the Irish, or the ancient Gaelic, or what, or the ancient Hibernians, or whatever. There's
yeah.
some weird dynamic going on there.
Well,
I think some of it has to do with, in prehistory. Sorry, Silas.
exactly.
The old Druidic culture either moving south as a result of the ice, or some of the old Atlantean gnosis getting passed down through Egypt and eventually into Israel. And there's some weird link that they're worried about, that they want to sever or destroy. There's something like that going on, perhaps.
Oh, absolutely. Funnily enough, if you read Barry Fell's books, America BC and Saga BC, in that very interesting books just in general, but In that,
Mhm.
he states that there was some form of sort of copper trade going on, and sort of,
Mhm.
I like what you're saying, a prehistoric period of Irish history, or Gaelic history, really.
Do you remember this gentleman that we had to boot off the server some time ago, and he was talking about the not the Formorians. There was some group of seafaring people that he attributed to the being akin to the ancient Irish,
Hyperboreans.
or yeah, perhaps, yeah, no, Phoenicians.
Oh, Phoenicians, yeah, yeah. Well, absolutely. I mean, of course, yeah. The Punic peoples, yeah. They also had, they set up. Well, that's also where the connection also ties in. They they set up in Britain at the time. It was called Albion. They also had a term for it, which translated to Tin Island, basically the island of Tin, or Tin Island, because it was so rich with tin, and of course tin is utilized within the bronze metallurgy, and it's a requisite thing. And tin, funnily enough, only it exists in pockets all over the world. So you actually have to develop, if you want to, of course, utilize bronze, and utilize it on an industrial scale, especially to equip armies, or to equip industry with, then you actually have to develop um, global maritime empires. It's just it's just what has to happen. And this is what developed the Bronze Age culture. Eventually, that led to the late Bronze Age collapse, which itself is probably linked to this same group. Um, anyway,
There's just
yeah.
on another note, I remember I was having a look through John Dee's diaries are online, and you can read through them, and some of them are like really short entries, and but the guy's name will come to me now. He was a kind of a British English adventurer of his day, and he was a bit of a spy. He was a bit of a
Francis
soldier.
Bacon,
He was a No, it wasn't Bacon. It's another
Raleigh,
name. It's a
Raleigh.
less much. No, this dude
No,
is like lesser known. You'd have to like you wouldn't have heard. I don't think like you wouldn't have commonly heard of this guy. I'd have to dig it up again. But John Dee's diary, it says he received a visit from him, and for some reason I looked up the guy's name, and it turns out the guy was a soldier as well in Ireland, possibly and probably under Cromwell, or at least around at that time, and or maybe subsequent to Cromwell. Because I think D is in the late 1600s, right? And Cromwell's invasion is in the late 1500s. Am I right in saying that?
no, no. Cromwell invaded Ireland in the mid 1600s. It was after the English Civil War, I think, but don't quote me on that. And John Dee was alive in 1582, or give or take. Um,
Okay,
yeah,
okay. Yeah, maybe I have the timeline a bit wrong. But okay, so this guy then was subsequent to Cromwell. He was in Ireland subsequent before Cromwell. Sorry, that's what I meant to say. He was in this guy I'm talking about that visited John Dee was a soldier in Ireland on behalf of Her Majesty or His Majesty or
mhm.
whatever, or before Cromwell arrived. But anyway, long story short, what I'm getting at, this particular guy, when I looked into him, the guy who visited John Dee was notorious for having the heads beheaded Irish, the victims of his conquest. He used to cut their heads off and put them along the access to his tent or his camp, so that he'd put fear in the Irish people, like. But notwithstanding all of this, it just I find it hard to understand. Um, like England, you're looking at a population in Britain of 60 million people. Ireland has had, somewhere, maybe in the famine we had 8 million, now down to whatever, 5 million, whatever. But I find it very difficult to understand how did England fail to establish a kind of a consistent earlier conquest of Ireland? Why did it seem to pose so much problems
Because
for
of
them?
its unity. It's the reason that Scotland, I think, was so easily taken along with Wales, because it didn't really have that underlying unity, per se. I mean, the Scots are absolutely notorious for backstabbing each other.
We've got that going on here too, by the way. We're very good at that.
Oh, I can imagine so, but um,
The Irish would have long ago would have conquered the world, but they're too busy beating the shit out of
yeah,
each other.
it's the same with us. But I think with Ireland, it sees itself as a nation state. See, remember, it's an Scotland is an amalgamation, and even from its earliest outset, I think in the 8th century, it was an amalgamation of the kingdoms of Dalriata, which were colonies of Ulster, the kingdom of Ulster, and of Pictland, and the Welsh of Altclute, or what we know now as Strathclyde, and the Anglo-Saxons of the sort of upper, around about Edinburgh downwards, along that eastern, southeastern border. So it was never homogenous. Remember when Ireland, in its sort of prehistory, its heroic past, the island of Ireland it was entirely homogenously Irish. Don't get me wrong, there were distinctions between the East and the West. Of course, probably less so prior to the Anglo-Normans and the sort of inundation of English culture. But so it would have been far more homogenous. That poses a problem for conquest because it's, again, if you show a sort of militaristic, imperialistic um, not mask, but presence, like the English did, and establish sort of this commercial, civilizational English law structure, which, of course, supersedes um, the more positive and constructive law of the Irish, which was the Brehon Law, dating all the way back basically in I think it was in the 7th century or so. That again, that that also poses a bit of an issue, right? Because people already have an alternative that's better. They have their own dialect. They have their own language rather. And in Scotland, prior to, of course, our sort of amalgamation into England, we were speaking Scots Lead, which is the Scots language, which is very similar to English, or at least the English at the time. Ireland was still speaking Gaelic. So again, there was an issue there too. By you speaking your own language, you have a semblance of your own culture. There's sort of the heart of the culture is there. Once you start speaking English, you eventually become Englishmen. I mean, let's be honest, most of the Scots now, though we still, believe ourselves to be Scottish, because we speak an English or an English dialect, we're effectively Englishmen with funny accents. And arguably they've done the same to Ireland, right? But it's
Absolutely.
taken them longer to do so because it was homogenous.
Well, well, we spoke Gaelic up to a certain point in time. We've never I've never fully understood how we came to speak English. Like in school, we were told, "Oh, the Irish language naturally died out," and it naturally, because over time the commerce and whatever English was seen as more modern. But I suspect there was some trauma there that the language was somehow forcibly changed, or I'm not sure. I don't know, but I think it's curious how we abandoned, and not only we abandoned our Gaelic language, but and began to speak English, but the Gaelic was subsequently then reintroduced by an agency that was kind of a gentrified
Yeah.
agency that superimposed the language in a kind of a unnatural manner, and it was somehow sort of like a luxury item that only the upper middle class or upper class could afford to go and study, and they were somehow very divorced from the reality of day-to-day life somehow. And even like Gaelic here at the moment, I get shot for saying this, but like a lot of the people who speak it and the TV programs, it seems to be like almost elitist somehow,
Mm.
and somehow a little bit, nose in the air. Like it's kind of, there's and there's little bits of the organic in there still, but it was very controlled. Like there was a Gaelic revival here that was very much controlled by the state. And, it was romanticized by the Anglo-Irish crew, by Yeats and Maud and these people who were all essentially English, but they gave back the Irish their culture, albeit in a pre-packaged, freeze-dried version of it, that was wrapped in, plastic and put it in the microwave for 20 minutes, and there's your culture back.
Yeah, we had.
But it's very much, you were going on to Wikipedia to look up Morrigan and look up the Tua de Danann and look up, Fionn McCool and look up the ancient past. It's been given to you by Microsoft and Bill Gates, and it's the whole thing was completely weird, and it wasn't an organic culture at all. It was a superimposed, like I said, freeze dried, pre-packaged version of what was bite sized. Take one per day after meals. Always read the label. It just never felt normal or natural.
No, well, it was never.
Very curious.
It was basically the same reason that we got a devolved parliament, or you guys got a Republic of Ireland, because it's Irish and all. It's Irish in name alone. It's Scottish in name alone.
Yeah,
And we have the same
absolutely.
thing, with you still sort of feel it with the when you go
Absolutely.
into the land, you still have that magic. You can't, unless you're Scottish or you're Irish, or of course I'm sure the English and the Welsh feel it as well, but you can never truly, you can't quantify it. It's the reason that of course laments are so. I mean, for example, look at Flower of Scotland. That we have for our national anthem, we have a lament. You know, I'm sure the Irish have similar national anthems too, right? They're all lamentations, and because there's a deep sort of thing in our soul, in our heart, that's been ripped out, right? And there's another reason why they got rid of. I mean, Scotland for a long time was called Little Ireland, quite literally. What was it? Hibernia Minora. And then, of course, you had my Hibernia Majora, which is, of course, the big Ireland and the little Ireland. So we have the same thing here. Gaelic has become this upper crust type thing. And of course, the problem is it'll eventually die out, and it morphs the language culturally from what it may have been. And again, that's by design. But remember as well, you had the British Crown versus Ireland, right? And the color of Ireland is, of course, green. Now, so it's similar to the wolf thing, right? Killing the wolf. The British Crown is the Keter. It's the top of the canopy of the tree. In a sense, it's God, right? Ireland is the green. It is there's two ways to see it. It's either the Tiferet, which is the heart, or the Malkuth, which is the wild or the earthly component. So it had to die because it symbolized humanity's literal connection vis-a-vis the soul to earth, in a sense, right? So it was the reason the wolves had to die. It was the reason that the clan system was destroyed in Scotland or in Ireland, right? It's the reason that the Welsh were supplanted vis-a-vis castles, because they have to destroy everything that is of a natural or organic quality, and to replace it effectively, right? They replace it with republics. They replace it with republic. It means of the people, right? When the fuck are any of these republics of the people? I mean, Oliver Cromwell, when he Charles the First had his head chopped off, completely shocking act. The executioner held up Charles the First's head and said, "Here is the head of the traitor." And then Oliver Cromwell states, "Now, Englishmen, you're all free." And then what's the first thing he did? Well, he banned Christmas. It's probably the most English thing you could think of, you know? Probably the most European thing you could think of, basically the Winter Festival. He banned it. He says, you have your freedoms now, and then systematically took away all of their freedoms.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I mean, it's so laughable. I mean, look at America, the American experiment. I mean, sure, they still have the First Amendment and Second Amendment still, but look at the federal government. They're actively attempting to undermine the people, which the Republic supposedly represents, right? So everything they do
uh-huh.
is an inversion, right? It's, um,
Maybe,
yeah,
maybe Charles the First was England's JFK moment. You know what I mean? Maybe that was the grassy knoll. You know what I mean? That was the death to democracy in front of the English people. Like,
and Cromwell was
and your man.
ruder.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Anyway, man,
Brilliant discussion,
time to
man.
check up.
Yeah,
I'll have to try and think of that guy's name. I'll dig it up again. The guy
yeah,
that visited Deke at Mortlake. He's an interesting character in his own right. But I'll dig it up again and I'll get it for you. But he was he
absolutely.
was he was in Limerick probably before Cromwell came here.
Well,
But like I said, there was an English dragoon or battalion that followed Cromwell hot on his heels to County Clare looking for him. So there was many an Englishman who wanted to see Oliver Cromwell dead and all that was around him dead. And I think actually he had a huge, from what I understand, there was a crowd down in Dorset in England that were actively out to fucking. He had a huge resistance down there,
oh
like.
yeah. Well, funnily enough, my grandfather on my mother's side, when obviously he was adopted into an English family, but um, he grew up in Tamworth, Staffordshire,
Mm,
and he would always talk about Cromwell. He actually they grew up in a time where they all, because I don't know, it was this weird thing. They all supported Cromwell, but I mean, he even said they exhumed his body. They literally
yeah,
hung him posthumously.
yeah.
Traitor. So that's how much the guy was absolutely hated.
He used to be buried in Westminster, I believe, and they dug him up.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Hated.
And as they say, the rest is history.
The rest is history, mate. Yeah.